Jose was not an ordinary guy, quite the opposite. He felt that he could get anything he wanted from life, not because he was capable or deserving of it, but simply because he desired it so much. He didn't like blending in with the crowd. He wanted to stand out, to make people tremble with fear at the sight of him. Jose was tough, just like his friends. They always had each other's backs, did everything together, and on that night when Jose saw a ring with the letter E engraved on it, he knew he had to have it because his girlfriend's name was Esther. He thought it would be a perfect romantic gesture. So he leaned over and took the ring off the lifeless girl's hand, a girl he and his friends had just killed. Jennifer Lee Ertman, who was 14 years old, and Elizabeth Christine Peña, who was 16, were best friends. Despite Jennifer being younger, she was obedient and well-mannered, and her positive influence had a wonderful impact on her friend Elizabeth. Elizabeth's parents were delighted that their daughter had such a reliable, faithful, and fantastic friend. The two girls shared an interest in makeup and fashion. They enjoyed dressing uniquely, skillfully applying makeup, and choosing accessories. They attended the same school in Houston, Texas, and were currently on summer vacation. Thursday, June 24, 1993 came around. A friend invited Elizabeth and Jennifer to a poolside party. At 4:45 p.m., Jennifer's father, Randy, dropped her off at Elizabeth's house, where at 8 p.m., Elizabeth's mother, Melissa, drove the girls to their friend Gina's house, who was hosting the party. The girls were excited and thrilled, enjoying the pleasant warm summer evening in the company of friends. Time flew by unnoticed, and the hour when their parents would expect them to be home was approaching. In principle, the parents weren't afraid to let the girls go out in the evening. They had cash with them just in case. Jennifer carried a pager and always kept $10 for a taxi in her pocket. And if they wanted their parents to pick them up, they only needed to find a telephone or a payphone and call. But this time, the girls decided to walk home. As they said their goodbyes to all their friends, the clock struck 10:45 and they were feeling the pressure of time. The girls had two options for walking home on foot. They could have taken the usual route by walking along the boulevard and turning onto the street leading to Elizabeth's house. This path would have taken them about half an hour. On the other hand, the park offered the possibility of saving 10 to 15 minutes. Despite their concerns about being late, they decided to go through the park. The route involved walking through the park, crossing a railway bridge, following a path, and eventually arriving at Elizabeth's house. Of course, at night, this route was dark and secluded, a place that teenage girls should avoid. However, many teenagers in the city casually used this shortcut. On the same night, Sandra Ertman woke up around 4 a.m. and noticed that the light in Jennifer's room was still on, which was unusual. Usually, when Jennifer came home, she would always turn off the light to let her parents know she had safely arrived and was going to sleep. Sandra assumed that Jennifer had stayed overnight at her friend Elizabeth's house without informing them. When her husband woke up a little later, he asked Sandra if their daughter had spent the night at Elizabeth's or Gina's house. Sandra replied that she wasn't sure. She wanted to cover for their daughter to avoid her father scolding her, but by 11 a.m., Sandra and Randy started calling Gina's and Elizabeth's families. The Peña family didn't answer the calls, presumably because they were at work. Around 1 p.m., Randy went to talk to Gina. She mentioned that she last saw the girls at 10:45 p.m. the previous night when they were heading to Elizabeth's house. Gina suggested that Randy should go together with her to the Peña family home. They did just that. Randy Ertman and Gina knocked on the door and even the windows of the house, calling out for Jennifer and Elizabeth, but received no response. Randy took Gina back home and returned to the Peña family's house. It was then that he finally met Adolfo and Melissa Peña. The parents of Elizabeth revealed that they hadn't seen the girls since the previous evening and assumed that their daughter was just sleeping in on her summer vacation, so they hadn't checked her room in the morning. They called the police, but initially, the authorities didn't take the disappearance of the girls seriously. In response, The families took matters into their own hands, printed flyers, went door to door asking neighbors if they had seen their daughters, but no one had any information. Adolfo came up with an idea to walk through the park since he knew about the short path to his house. He walked across the railway bridge and the path where the girls might have walked. Something urged him to check near the tree line, but fortunately, he didn't give in to that intuition. 4 days of uncertainty passed when a call came into the Crime Stoppers hotline. An anonymous caller reported that the girls were in the park. Officers immediately began the search. At the edge of the wooded area, an officer noticed something resembling an item of women's clothing. As he approached, he realized it was not just clothing but the bodies of the girls. The victims were lying on their backs just a few meters apart, naked, and their bodies had already greatly decomposed due to the summer heat. Insects were present, making it even more difficult for even experienced police officers to look at the bodies. Initially, they wanted to keep the horrifying find hidden from reporters and the public, but the news spread rapidly. Randy Ertman was speaking with journalists about his daughter's disappearance when a reporter informed him over the radio that the bodies had been found in the park. Randy persuaded the reporters to take him to the park. Police officers had to restrain him as he attempted to break through the police tape, shouting, "She has light hair. Tell me one of them has light hair." He only stepped back when a detective told him that he couldn't provide any information yet and needed Jennifer's dental records. It was then that Randy understood the officers were trying to shield him from the sight of the bodies, an image he would never be able to forget. Dental records confirmed that the bodies found in the park belonged to 14-year-old Jennifer Ertman and 16-year-old Elizabeth Peña. The cause of death was strangulation. Several shoe prints were discovered around the bodies, indicating that there were multiple perpetrators involved. Now, when the girls were found, the police were determined to find those responsible for their deaths. Although it was assumed that the call to Crime Stoppers could be entirely anonymous, the police traced it back. The call led them to the home of the Kent family. The homeowner, Joe Kent, admitted to making the call. He listed several names and claimed that these individuals were the ones who killed the girls. Among them was his own brother, Peter Kent. The police searched Peter's room and found jewelry belonging to the girls, which confirmed Joe's statement. But what exactly happened that night? So, Jennifer and Elizabeth decided to take a shortcut through the park because they had promised their parents to return before the designated time. It was around 11 o'clock, and the park was not a particularly safe place for two young girls at that time. Nevertheless, they walked through the park and encountered two young men. The guys' names were Frank and Roman Sandoval. They didn't say anything to the girls, didn't attempt to harass, shout, or whistle at them. They simply passed by. It would have been wonderful if they had told Jennifer and Elizabeth about the gang meeting taking place in the park and advised them to turn around and go in a different direction. That would have saved them. However, the brothers just walked past. Soon after, they heard a woman's scream. Did they realize what was happening? Yes, of course, they did. But they didn't do anything. They just left. The twin brothers, Frank and Roman, had just attended a ceremony for initiating a new gang member, which was held in the park. 6 young people aged between 14 and 18 took part in the ceremony. Essentially, they were all teenagers. The participants included 18-year-olds Jose Medine, Derek Sean O'Brien, and Peter Kentua, as well as 17-year-old Efren Perez and 14-year-old Venancio Medine, the younger brother of Jose. The new 17-year-old gang member whose initiation was taking place was named Raul the Ariel. So, besides the Sandoval brothers, the 6 teenagers gathered in the park to initiate the new gang member. The initiation was quite peculiar. Raul had to fight with each of the guys for 5 minutes. He didn't succeed entirely, but they accepted him nonetheless. After the formal part, if you can call it that, the guys stayed in the park, drinking and chatting. Suddenly, Frank Sandoval had an uneasy feeling and insisted that he and his brother leave. Following the twins, 18-year-old Jose Medin and his 14-year-old brother were about to leave when suddenly Jose noticed Elizabeth. He attempted to grab her chest, but she pushed his hand away and wanted to continue walking. However, this was not part of Jose's plans. He said, "No, little girl, where do you think you're going?" and put his hand around her neck, dragging her down the small slope. Jennifer was walking slightly ahead and had already passed the spot where the gang's initiation was taking place. She had every chance to escape and save herself, but upon hearing Elizabeth's cries, she rushed to help her. Not many would have intervened in such a situation, but Jennifer acted exactly like that. She saw only Jose and thought that she and Elizabeth could handle one guy together, giving her a real chance to save her friend. She probably didn't suspect that there were 5 more teenagers down the slope. So when Jennifer rushed back to Elizabeth, other members of the gang grabbed her and knocked her to the ground. The guys forced the girls to take off their clothes and underwear, and for the next hour 5 guys in turn, and sometimes at the same time, mocked Jennifer and Elizabeth. 14-year-old Venancio Medellin watched in amazement. Later, he will tell how the girls fought off their attackers. Jennifer bit the assailants, while Elizabeth kicked the air and screamed. They were, of course, weaker than the 6 teenagers, the boys, but they still did everything they could to escape. During the attack, the victims often looked at each other, which made them cry even harder. At first, Elizabeth didn't cry, she was more in anger. However, seeing what the boys were doing to Jennifer, tears started streaming down her cheeks as well. The boys approvingly patted each other on the back when they switched places and crudely insulted the girls. Even Jose dared to ask Elizabeth for her name and phone number while mocking her. 14-year-old Venancio Medin watched the attack in horror. When he asked to hang out with his older brother, he probably didn't expect anything like this. He also didn't want to participate in the relentless abuse, but he feared the other boys. So, after their instructions, he also mistreated Jennifer. It is reported that he was the only one who asked his brother and Peter Kent to release the girls, but Peter whispered to him that they saw their faces and could identify them. The leader of the group, 18-year-old Peter Kent, declared that they must not allow the victims to be identified later. The newcomer, Raoul, yelled at Jennifer, ordering her to kneel. He and Sean O'Brien began choking Jennifer with Sean's red shoelaces. But they tore apart, and they had to finish what they started with the girls' shoelaces. Elizabeth, who was forced to witness Jennifer's murder, pleaded with the boys to spare her, offering to give them her phone number so they could meet up and hang out if they let her go. She did and said everything she could to save her life. However, it didn't work, and Elizabeth made one last desperate attempt to escape. Unfortunately, she was intercepted. Peter Cantu always boasted about his steel-toed boots. It was with those boots that he attacked the girl, breaking her ribs and knocking out several teeth. Then, Peter, Jose, and Efren strangled Elizabeth with shoelaces. At that moment, they noticed Jennifer was still alive, and they started stomping on the victims' bodies and necks to ensure their demise. It was a monstrous murder of the girls, who simply wanted to take a shortcut so their parents wouldn't scold them. Without a shred of remorse, the killers divided the spoils, the few pieces of jewelry that belonged to Jennifer and Elizabeth. They even took the watch with Goofy, a Disney character that Jennifer liked. On the first ring was engraved the letter E, and Jose took the ring to give it to his girlfriend, Esther. After committing the crime, several boys went to Peter's place, where his brother Joe and his 16-year-old wife, Christina, were present. Christina noticed that they were covered in blood, disheveled, as if they had just been in a fight. They threw the bloodied items at her and ordered her to get rid of them. Christina asked what had happened, and Jose replied that they had just had some fun. Then they began relishing the details of what they had done, showing enthusiasm and boasting, without any sign of remorse. It disgusted Christina and Joe to hear this, but they pretended that everything was normal and silently listened. Christina herself had been a victim of violence in the past, and the actions of the gang deeply affected her. When the boys left, She told her husband that he should call the police anonymously. Joe was hesitant because it wasn't just about his brother but also about the other gang members who could seek revenge against him. However, Christina couldn't bear the thought of the girls lying in the park without their families having a proper chance to say goodbye to them. She convinced Joe to make an anonymous call to Crime Stoppers, ensuring that nobody would know it was him. The next day, Joe made the call in a hushed tone, informing the police where to find the bodies. Initially, the police didn't find anything, but after 4 days, a persistent officer eventually discovered the crime scene. Undoubtedly, Christina and Joe were very scared when the police traced the anonymous call, but they had made the right decision in doing so. On June 29, 1993, all 6 members of the gang were arrested. The red nail polish belt they used to try to strangle Jennifer was found in O'Brien's apartment. During the interrogations, the friendship between the boys came to an abrupt end. Each of them claimed to have been in the park, but others were the ones who killed the girls. The police pieced together the full picture of how events unfolded that night. Nearly all the details about what happened were known thanks to the testimony of 14-year-old Venanzio Medellin. The boys were tried separately, so the families had to listen to the horrifying details of their daughter's murders 5 times. Venanzio Medellin was the exception. He made a deal and was sentenced to 40 years in prison. The other 5 were sentenced to the death penalty. In the cases of Jose Medellin, Derek O'Brien, and Peter Cantu, the sentences were carried out. Sean O'Brien and Jose Medellin found the courage to apologize to the victims' families, but Peter Cantu didn't even do that. Adolfo and Melissa Peña believe it doesn't matter, as he wouldn't say anything that would change anything. The sentences of Efren and Raul were changed to life imprisonment because they were 17 at the time of the crime, and the Supreme Court prohibited the execution of individuals who were younger than 18 when they committed the crime. The court proceedings were extremely difficult, not only because the victims' families had to listen to their daughters' torture 5 times, but also because the criminals' relatives accused Jennifer and Elizabeth's parents of allowing them to go to the park, even though their own relatives were drinking and fighting there too. Efren's stepfather approached Elizabeth's father and said in Spanish, "This is your fault for not raising your daughter properly." The most horrifying aspect of this story is that it wasn't the gang's first crime. Sean O'Brien, Peter Cantu, and Jose Medellin had already murdered a young mother, 27-year-old Patricia Lopez. She was waiting at a gas station for her husband to pick her up after her car broke down. The killers dragged her into the park, where they assaulted and strangled her with Sean O'Brien's red nail polish belt. O'Brien's fingerprints were found at the crime scene, and all of this happened 6 months before Jennifer and Elizabeth's murder. However, he was not charged for it. In addition to that, the criminals attacked random pedestrians on the street at least twice, including an armed robbery of another teenager and the murder of a completely unknown man. Despite the horror of the case, it had some positive consequences. Jennifer and Elizabeth's parents showed the world what it means to be a victim but not a helpless one. When the judge asked the parents if they wanted to address Peter Cantu, Randy Ertman immediately stood up and expressed everything he needed to say to Peter. Many criticized the judge for allowing Randy to yell at Peter. However, thanks to this, now after the sentencing, the victims' families have the right to address the perpetrator. They can also be present during the execution, which was previously prohibited. The families of Elizabeth and Jennifer visited the executions of the 3 killers. The families continue to fight for justice to this day. All 6 convicts appealed their sentences. Venanzio was denied parole 5 times, and each time the families met with the judges to prevent his release. Randy said, "I want this man to sit in jail for the rest of his life. I want this piece of crap to die in jail, and I will do everything in my power to keep him in jail. Do you want him as your neighbor? Do you want him living next to you?" Jennifer and Elizabeth had no choice. He had a choice. He could have walked away, but he didn't. Unfortunately, after his daughter's murder, Randy tried to find solace at the bottom of a bottle. But after 5 years, he pulled himself together, quit drinking, and started the path of healing. He and his wife moved away because everything in their hometown reminded them of their daughter. In 2014, at the age of 61, Randy Ertman passed away from lung cancer. Jennifer was his only daughter, and he fought not only for her but for the other victims as well. Thanks to him, other victims' families now have more rights and opportunities. Several years before the John Benet Ramsey case, America was trying to solve the mystery of the disappearance of 7-year-old Jacqueline Dovaliby. Was she abducted by a stranger who entered her home under the cover of night? Or did she become a victim within her own family? The police were convinced that the culprits were always in plain sight, whereas no one who knew the family doubted their complete innocence. Midlothian, located in the state of Illinois, USA, is a small town where everyone knows each other. It is situated approximately 30 minutes south of the bustling streets of Chicago and is considered a quiet suburb where there is always a sense of being in a familiar place. However, in 1988, the town changed forever when 7-year-old Jacqueline Dovaliby disappeared from her own bedroom in the middle of the night. Jacqueline lived in a cozy, ranch-style home with her parents, David and Cynthia, and her 4-year-old brother, Davy. The family resided in a beautiful location, surrounded by several nature preserves, all within walking distance from their home. Jacqueline's biological father, Jimmy Guess, had no involvement in her life after a bitter divorce from Cynthia shortly after their daughter was born. David Dovaliby adopted Jacqueline when he married Cynthia 5 years ago when Jacqueline was 2 years old, and he was the only father she knew. Cynthia worked as a dietitian at the local hospital, and David was a carpenter who had been promoted to a foreman. David and Jacqueline had an instant connection, often going fishing and bowling together. According to one neighbor whose daughter was friends with Jacqueline, she was a happy little girl who never showed any signs of sadness or anger. According to all accounts, the Dovalibys were a typical, close-knit suburban family. On the evening of September 10, 1988, Cynthia took Jacqueline and Davy to a nearby KFC Kentucky Fried Chicken restaurant, while David met up with his friends and went bowling. When all family members returned home, they watched television, and Jacqueline, wearing her favorite purple and white pajamas, kissed Cynthia and David goodnight. What exactly happened in the house that night remains unclear, but the next morning, the little brunette with brown eyes was no longer there. David and his son woke up earlier than the other family members on the next morning, and around 7:45, David noticed that the front door was slightly ajar. At first, he thought that his mother, who lived with the family, had left it open and didn't worry much about it. He prepared breakfast for Davy and turned on the television. A little later, Cynthia woke up and went to wake up their daughter but couldn't find Jacqueline in her bedroom. The parents called Jacqueline's friends, thinking that she might have gone outside to play. While they searched for the child inside the house and in the neighborhood, Cynthia noticed that the basement window was broken and wide open. David immediately called the police and reported his daughter's disappearance. After investigators arrived at the house, Cynthia and David explained that none of them had heard anything unusual during the night, and they had all been sound asleep. Nothing was missing from the house except Jacqueline's blanket, which matched the colors of her pajamas. Furthermore, there were no signs of a struggle. Investigators needed to determine whether someone had broken into the house and taken Jacqueline, or if she had left the house herself, only to be taken by someone else. Although there were no phone calls or ransom notes, the FBI agents took over the investigation, presuming that they were dealing with a kidnapping rather than a runaway case. Soon, the news of a possible abduction spread throughout the town. The suburb mainly consisted of families with young children, and the possibility that someone had broken into a family's home and abducted their little girl in the middle of the night while everyone was asleep was a horrifying revelation. Considering that there were no signs of a struggle, investigators began to wonder if the girl might have left with someone she knew. If the intruder had entered the house through the broken basement window, they needed to be familiar with the layout of the house to enter the girl's room without waking the other family members, investigators concluded. We are looking at it with an open mind as a potential abduction, but also as an abduction with someone known to the family, said Police Captain John Bitton. This statement led Cynthia to recall an unsettling incident that occurred several years earlier. After a bitter custody battle during which her former partner, Jimmy Guess, did everything in his power to keep their daughter with him, he had broken into their home and attempted to take their daughter. Therefore, Cynthia suspected his involvement in Jacqueline's disappearance because she knew he was capable of such actions. Jacqueline's grandmother, Anne Dovaliby, admits that she wasn't initially worried about her granddaughter's safety because she believed that Jacqueline had been taken by her biological father, and she was confident they would quickly get her back. However, she couldn't have known that Jimmy had been in prison in Florida for the previous 4 months during Jacqueline's disappearance and was soon ruled out as a suspect. Suspicion also fell on Jacqueline's uncle, Timothy Guest, who lived nearby and suffered from paranoid schizophrenia. However, he had an alibi. It was at this point that Cynthia began to worry that something bad had happened to her daughter. The parents of the girl, Cynthia and David, were questioned multiple times in the following days. They didn't hide anything. They explained that Jacqueline had gone to bed at 10 p.m., and when Cynthia went to check on her at 11 p.m., she was sound asleep. The police became increasingly skeptical of the parents' story. It was difficult for them to believe that a person unfamiliar with the layout of the house could have crawled through the basement window without disturbing the towel dryer right beneath the window. Then, they would have had to walk down the hallway to the girl's room and take her away without waking any of the other family members. The only sign that a stranger had been in the house was the broken window. No fingerprints or signs of a struggle were found. Indeed, when it comes to fingerprints and other evidence, it's important to note that the police themselves made a series of mistakes that could have influenced their conclusions. They never secured the girl's room to prevent anyone from entering it, and they didn't thoroughly search the house. A forensic expert took photographs, but he didn't even bother to take close-up pictures of the broken window. He checked the window and the front door for fingerprints, but not the back door. What was even more astonishing was that the police allowed friends of the family to clean up their house and even sweep away the glass from the broken window. The police just stood by and watched as they cleaned up, destroying any evidence that the kidnapper might have left behind. Immediately after the girl's disappearance, Jacqueline's parents were asked to take a polygraph test. Cynthia was too distraught for such a test. Friends recall that she was in a terrible state, constantly feeling nauseous. David underwent the polygraph test, which he passed. But in the minds of the police, everything seemed to point to the parents. The number of potential suspects sharply narrowed after one of the forensic experts stated that, in his opinion, the basement window had been broken from the inside. On September 14th, 5 days after the girl's disappearance, the parents attempted to take a polygraph test again. Cynthia's results were inconclusive due to her emotional state. David's results were also inconclusive, and the polygraph examiner accused him of not cooperating with the investigation. David in turn claimed that the polygraph examiner instructed him to answer yes to all questions, including the question, "Did you kill your daughter?" to which David refused to answer yes. Afterward, David was taken into an interrogation room and was not released for 5 hours. Later that evening, Michael Chapman pulled into the parking lot of the Islander Apartments on 1912 Canal Street in Blue Island, a town located about 5 kilometers from the girl's home. When Chapman exited his car, he noticed an unpleasant odor in the fresh autumn air. He spotted something wrapped up in the grass, which he described as a wrapped-up object. As he approached, he saw a head and a hand, and he immediately ran inside to call the police. Jacqueline's body was discovered, and she was still bound with a 2-meter rope, which was considered evidence of the crime. Her soiled underwear was found about 60 centimeters from her body. As for the police, they continued to question Jacqueline's father for about 1.5 hours without informing him that his daughter had been found. They tried to convince him to confess to the crime. When Officer Kevin Shaughnessy finally told him about Jacqueline's discovery, David didn't believe him, thinking it was another police trick to make him confess. This is likely why he responded with the phrase, "I guess you think I should cry now?" However, Officer Shaughnessy interpreted these words differently, and they convinced him not to pursue other suspects. In any case, there was no evidence against David, and he was released to go home, where he found his distraught wife and realized that his daughter was truly gone. By morning, with the help of dental records, the body was officially identified as Jacqueline Dovaliby. Initially, based solely on the appearance of the body, there was speculation that she had been struck on the head, but the Cook County coroner, Dr. Robert Stein, stated that the condition of the body was the result of rapid decomposition due to the unusually warm September weather. Dr. Stein could not determine with certainty whether the girl had been sexually assaulted or not due to the state of decomposition. Although the exact time of death couldn't be determined either, Robert Stein concluded that she had been dead for several days, and the terrible crime was most likely committed early Saturday morning, right after her disappearance. After the body was identified, and given that they had been individually questioned for hours before Jacqueline was found, both Cynthia and David hired lawyers who advised them to invoke their Fifth Amendment rights and not answer any more questions from investigators. They had already told the police everything they knew, provided blood and urine samples, and gave permission for investigators to examine any family medical records that might be relevant. They also allowed investigators access to their home for all 5 days that Jacqueline was missing. The Fifth Amendment to the United States Constitution allows citizens to refuse to answer any questions that may incriminate them. The Dovalibys had every right to invoke the Fifth Amendment. However, with no other suspects, law enforcement focused their attention on Cynthia and David as the primary suspects and claimed that it was suspicious that they were not cooperating with investigators. Police rushed to accuse the family of refusing to cooperate with the investigation. Prosecutor Patrick O'Brien explained, "Even if you are being looked at as a suspect, and you know deep down inside that you didn't do this, and it's unfair, the idea of not cooperating with the police that are investigating the murder of your daughter seems overly concerned about your personal interests." On the day after the funeral, a team of 20 police officers executed search warrants at the Dovaliby home. They emerged from the house with several large bags containing items they wanted to examine in the laboratory. Additionally, they confiscated the family's blue Chevrolet Malibu. Months passed, but there were no updates or new information about the case. However, the police made a statement indicating that the family members had not been excluded as suspects. Cynthia's lawyer, Lawrence Hyman, criticized the police investigation, calling it a blatant violation of the law. While Cynthia and David continued to avoid communicating with the media, they had a multitude of supporters. Neighbors stood by the family, telling journalists that the Dovalibys were a loving and caring family, and they had never heard either of the parents raise their voice at Jacqueline or Davy. David's boss, Ross Patterson, recalled, "The only time David took a day off work was when he needed to get documents for Jacqueline's adoption." However, this did not convince the investigators. Adhering to the theory that Cynthia and David could be involved in the crime, they returned to the location where the body was found and began showing photos of Cynthia, David, and their car to residents of the Islander apartments, hoping to find any witnesses who might have seen them in the area. On November 22nd, Cynthia and David were arrested and charged with first-degree murder. Their son Davy was placed under the care of the Department of Family and Children's Services. It became known that a tenant of the apartment complex where the body was found had told investigators that he had seen David in a blue Chevy Malibu in the parking lot. A witness, a 35-year-old city transportation worker named Everett Mann, said that around 2 a.m. on September 10th, he was pulling into the parking lot, and his headlights illuminated a blue Chevy with a driver he claimed was David Dovaliby. During Cynthia and David's arrest, they were deliberately paraded in front of the media so that as many photos as possible could be taken, seemingly to convey the message, "Look, we've done our job." Detectives boasted about having a wealth of evidence against David and Cynthia, including 2 witnesses. However, it remained unclear why loving parents would act this way towards their daughter. Were there enough pieces of evidence? Or were the investigators rushing to take the case to court for some reason? Perhaps the answer to this question lies in the fact that on the same day as the parents' arrest, a major news story emerged. Richard M. Daley, the state's chief prosecutor whose office was handling the case, announced his candidacy for mayor of Chicago. Critics accused him of using a high-profile crime in his political game. But despite the criticism, Daley became the mayor of Chicago, and the case was handed over to the court. It is widely known that eyewitness testimonies are highly unreliable. Nevertheless, the witness statements suggesting that David was near the crime scene were enough to charge him and his wife with first-degree murder. Blue Island Police Chief Paul Greaves referred to these witness testimonies as excellent evidence that allowed them to rule out other leads. The police never disclosed what those other leads were, but relying solely on witness testimony to exclude all other possibilities seemed somewhat prejudicial, especially considering that Cynthia was not linked to the crime scene. Both spouses were denied bail, and it was revealed that Cynthia was in the early stages of pregnancy. In the search for new evidence, the police decided to focus on the couple's 5-year-old son, Davy. who was examined by a doctor. Supposedly, the doctor found traces on his body that could have resulted from a belt, some of which were old while others were recent. The police suspected that Cynthia and David had abused Davy at home, suggesting it could be a motive for the crime. Patrick Murphy, Davy's state-appointed guardian, said that the police and prosecutors continuously questioned the child for days. He added that after speaking with Davy and reviewing his medical records, he couldn't understand how they arrived at such a conclusion because he couldn't find anything that indicated violence against the child. He also mentioned that Davy constantly pleaded to see his parents, and he missed them greatly. In mid-December, Cynthia and David were released on bail, but Davy was not allowed to return home with his parents. He was placed in the custody of David's sister Rose and her husband John. Davy was only allowed to see his parents during supervised visits. In April 1990, the court proceedings began. It became clear early on that the evidence gathered by law enforcement was not as compelling as initially reported. The prosecutors didn't even have a clear motive for the crime, but fortunately for them, they were not legally obligated to provide one. Their main argument was straightforward. There were no outsiders in the house, so the Dovalibys must be guilty. The defense argued that due to the poor police work, it was impossible to determine how the intruder had entered the house and what had transpired inside during that night. The idea that the intruder needed to know the layout of the house to find Jacqueline's bedroom seemed far-fetched. The family lived in a typical ranch-style house. Many such houses are built with a similar layout. Anyone who had ever been inside a similar house would likely know the layout. The prosecutors also tried to argue that the intruder had to navigate through a window without disturbing objects below, such as a vanity, a TV stand, and a towel rack. To demonstrate that this was possible, David filmed a video showing how a neighbor climbed through the basement window, propped his leg on the wall, and didn't disturb any objects below. Furthermore, it turned out that the prosecution had only one witness, not two. Everett Mann, the key prosecution witness, admitted during the trial that he had identified David solely by his prominent nose. He was about 70 meters away from the man in the parking lot and only remembered his distinctive nose, as it was dark and the lighting was quite dim. Moreover, during the photo identification, Everett was shown a frontal picture of David, while he had only seen the person in profile. Additionally, David's photo was much larger than the 4 photos of other men. Everett admitted that the person he saw that night could have been African American or Caucasian, or even a man or a woman, and all he saw was a silhouette that only looked male. In a night without moonlight, 3 weeks into the trial, the jury members were taken to the same parking lot where Everett had supposedly seen David. They stood in the same spot under similar conditions as Everett. They could hardly see anything. In reality, they couldn't even notice a nearby garbage can, which was said to be near where the car was parked. Several neighbors of the Dovalibys also contradicted the witness's account regarding the car. The defense lawyers built their case around the fact that a remarkably similar crime occurred in the same neighborhood about a year after Jacqueline's abduction. On September 2, 1989, Perry Hernandez broke into a home in Blue Island and kidnapped a 6-year-old girl while her family slept. He entered by breaking a window and made his way inside without waking anyone. The man took the girl to a railroad bridge near the Calumet River, tormented her, and then allowed her to return home. This happened within a mile and a half of where Jacqueline was found. An interesting detail emerged. The girl Hernandez was living with at the time also owned a Chevy Malibu, and Perry often stayed overnight at her apartment. In fact, even on the night before Jacqueline's disappearance, someone had entered another home in Midlothian. Elizabeth Peña woke up in the middle of the night and thwarted an attempted robbery or abduction of her daughter. She identified the person she saw in her home that night as Perry Hernandez and expressed confidence that he intended to abduct her 7-year-old daughter, whom she found tightly wrapped in 3 towels, as if someone had intended to take her away. While this may seem like more than a coincidence, Judge Richard Neville stated that he did not consider this evidence and prohibited Cynthia and David's defense from presenting these facts in court. However, the little girl abducted by Perry Hernandez was invited to testify. She recalled that while she was with the kidnapper under the bridge, he held a rope, as if threatening her with it. Besides the striking similarities between the 2 cases, this demonstrated that a small child could indeed be taken from a bedroom without waking anyone. However, in court, The defense made a mistake by failing to establish a connection with the jury members. They wanted David to take the witness stand and firmly declare his innocence, looking them in the eye. But that didn't happen. The most significant obstacle for the defense turned out to be the 17 autopsy photographs and remains presented to the jury. The prosecutors claimed that the photos were meant to help determine the time and cause of death. The defense believed that these photos simply contributed to bias among the jury members. An attorney explains, "You're shown a beautiful girl next to a photograph of her body, and of course the jury members thought someone must pay for this crime. However, the photos didn't convince the judge, who dropped the charges against Cynthia because her only connection to the crime was being in the house. The judge ordered to keep his decision secret because David's fate still lay in the hands of the jury due to the testimony of Everett Mann. After 14 hours, the jury delivered their verdict: guilty. Everyone believed that David would be acquitted, and the media were already waiting for him outside the courthouse for interviews. It was a shock to everyone that he was found guilty. The judge sentenced David to 45 years in prison. Many didn't understand why the jury had no doubts about his guilt, but suddenly everything fell into place. In an interview with a reporter, the jury foreperson confessed why a guilty verdict was reached. It turns out that the jury saw photographs of the Dovaliby home. In one photo, the bedroom door of young Davy showed a dent from a fist, and the jurors believed this indicated David Dovaliby's violent nature. Coming to this conclusion, the jury members decided that there had been a lot of violence in the house. How wrong they were. The fist-sized dent had appeared long before David moved into the house with Cynthia, and perhaps even before Jacqueline's birth. David's younger brother had struck the door with his fist when he was a teenager. The house belonged to David's mother, and the family always had more important things to spend money on, and the door was never replaced. Neither the defense nor the prosecution mentioned this dent, so the jury's decision was based on things that were not even discussed in court. The jury foreperson added that if they had their way, they would have accused Cynthia as well. During this time, Cynthia fought for custody of Davy. Several psychologists and social workers testified, stating that there was no hint that Davy had ever been mistreated, and Cynthia was a kind and loving mother who doted on Davy, and he on her. By mid-July, Davy was allowed to return home to his mother and his recently born sister, Carly Marie. The fact that the jury was biased against David needed to be used to challenge the verdict. Cynthia and the family's friends formed a committee to fight for David's release. One committee member offered a $10,000 reward for any information about the crime. Additionally, the committee allowed them to connect with people who could assist with the case. One of those people turned out to be Robert Byman, an attorney from the Chicago law firm Jenner and Block, who volunteered to work on the case pro bono. Initially, due to police statements, he also believed in David's guilt, but after studying the case materials, he realized there was no evidence against him at all. He understood that David was wrongly accused due to human nature. Byman explained, 12 good and decent members of the jury were entrusted with deciding the fate of this case. Their choice was simple, to stand up and leave, saying, "Sorry, Jacqueline, we can't do anything for you," or to convict the only person sitting before them. They chose the latter. In October, Robert Byman filed a petition for David's release based on new evidence. Gerald Bauman, a prisoner at Cook County Jail, claimed that he had overheard Perry Hernandez confess to the murder. However, after the petition was filed, Gerald refused to sign his previously given sworn statements, fearing for his safety, and claimed that he had received threats after news of this new evidence came to light. The appeal garnered such a significant response that, for the first time, the Illinois Appellate Court allowed video recording of the case proceedings. The Illinois Appellate Court had three options: uphold the guilty verdict, order a new trial, or completely exonerate David, which would mean he could never be tried for this case again. 5 months later, the court's decision was announced. Complete exoneration. The court ruled that the chief witness's testimony had been inaccurate and unreliable, and the prosecutors had failed to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that David was the only person with the opportunity to commit the crime. The judges noted that all the basement windows had been left unlocked that night, and any of them could have allowed the perpetrator inside, but unfortunately they were not checked for fingerprints. They also criticized the decision to show the jury 17 gruesome body photographs that were unnecessary. On November 13, 1991, After spending 18 months in prison, David walked free. I've been a lawyer for almost 30 years, and in all that time, there have only been 3 times when I was as happy as I was the day I walked David Dovaliby out of prison. Our judicial system is designed to work in 95% of cases. This time the system failed. It convicted an innocent man, said Robert Byman. However, the Dovaliby family was about to experience yet another shocking turn of events in one of the most paradoxical and unusual murder sagas in modern Chicago history. It became known that Rob Warden and David Protess, who were writing a book about the case titled Gone in the Night, had discovered a new potential suspect. Timothy Guess was a 31-year-old brother of Jacqueline's biological father. Timothy had been diagnosed with schizophrenia and lived in a house with his mother not far from Jacqueline's home. Initially, he claimed to have been working at the Park Avenue restaurant in Harvey on the night of the murder, and 3 restaurant employees confirmed his alibi. However, now 2 of them had recanted their statements. At least 5 regulars of the establishment also claimed that Timothy wasn't there that night. Warden and Protess spoke to Timothy, who told them that he often heard voices in his head and suffered from memory lapses. He told them that he was guided by a spirit, and this spirit had allowed him to describe the layout of the Dovaliby house, even though he had never been inside. He could even describe how to get to Jacqueline's bedroom. Timothy described the blanket in which the body was wrapped, and somehow knew that the light in the bedroom was off on the night of her disappearance. However, Timothy was never seriously considered a suspect even after this information came to light. He passed away in 2002. Protest said, "I felt that the case was solved, but I never thought anyone would be held accountable for the crime. The state would be too embarrassed to admit they had wrongly accused Cynthia and David." Since then, the Dovaliby family has moved and changed their last name due to the excessive attention on their lives. They still hope that Jacqueline's murder will be solved. Something terrible happened in that ranch-style home in Midlothian, Illinois, on the night of September 9, 1988. But 3 decades later, there are still no answers as to what exactly transpired. While the local police claim the case is open, there are evidently no leads being pursued. Every U.S. citizen has the right to invoke the Fifth Amendment, but when Cynthia and David exercised that right, they found themselves at the center of a wrongly and negligently conducted investigation. Brent Poole took his wife's hand and surveyed the stretch of sandy beach between the Atlantic Ocean and vast dunes. They strolled slowly past private beach houses, and as they were engulfed by the darkness of the last untouched miles of forest running alongside the shore, the young man once again marveled at how romantic Myrtle Beach was. Situated between South Carolina and North Carolina, it was at the heart of the popular Grand Strand Beach. Like many tourists before him, Brent was enchanted by the rhythmic movement of the waves crashing onto the white sandy beach. Hand in hand with his beloved wife, he felt warm and joyful in his heart. Chuckling like a boy, Brent suggested to Renee, "Let's do it right here." The girl smiled and began to undress. A light breeze blowing in from the ocean cooled their naked bodies as the young couple enjoyed each other's company. After a while, Brent helped Renee get dressed, and he checked his watch. It was nearly midnight. They needed to head back to the hotel. Walking back hand in hand, they made plans for the future. In the distance, they noticed a large man dressed in black, his body covered tightly. But it wasn't just his appearance that frightened them. It was the fact that the man, who was initially heading in a different direction, suddenly turned and started following them. They picked up their pace, but they couldn't shake him off. The man ran ahead and leapt in front of them. He wore a ski mask, and in his hands was a gun that he pointed at the young couple. The weapon was black and looked almost like a plastic toy. The man ordered them to lie down on the ground. "This guy is crazy," Renee thought. Brent remembered that he had an army Swiss knife in his pocket, which he bought at a flea market for Christmas. But what could he do with a knife against a gun? The stranger demanded that they hand over all their valuables. After taking their jewelry and money, the robber aimed the gun at Brent. He pulled the trigger once, twice, 3 times, but the gun refused to fire. While the robber confidently reloaded the weapon, A terrified Renee hoped that it was all just a tasteless joke and that he would leave soon. Then the man aimed the gun at Brent again. Brent begged him to spare his life. The robber smirked, glanced at Renee, and asked why he should spare him. "Because I have a daughter whom I love very much," Brent replied firmly. The shooter's eyes narrowed. He put the gun under Brent's chin and made him kneel. He pulled the trigger for the 4th time. Only this time, there was no misfire. Brent probably didn't hear the shot or feel it. But the shooter seemed unsatisfied and fired again. He wanted to make sure Brent was dead, although there was no need. The stranger turned and walked toward Renee, who lay on the sand, trembling with fear. She thought she would be the next one, but the stranger simply turned abruptly and ran toward the dunes. Renee got on her knees and called her husband's name softly through her tears. Just 10 minutes ago, they were celebrating their 3rd wedding anniversary, making plans for the future, joyfully discussing their little daughter Katie's first trip to the ocean. Renee sat by Brent, frightened and shocked. It's unclear how long she stayed in that state, but finally, she realized she needed to call for help. She remembered seeing a patrol car in the distance with her husband. With difficulty, she staggered in that direction. On June 9, 1998, shortly before midnight, Myrtle Beach patrolman Scott Brown was cruising along the deserted coastline of the Grand Strand when the headlights of his SUV suddenly caught sight of a girl frantically waving at him in the darkness. She was in a state of hysteria, and it's not surprising given what she told the patrolman. It was far beyond anything Scott was used to dealing with, like stolen wallets. But a stolen wallet was just the beginning of Renee's story. The masked stranger dressed in black had robbed them, and then he shot her husband twice in the head. The girl recounted how they obediently did everything the stranger told them, but it didn't save them. Scott, who had recently become a patrolman, was stunned upon hearing what had happened. Nonetheless, he quickly got his bearings and called for backup. On the crime scene, the arriving police officers found casings indicating that the perpetrator had used an automatic or semi-automatic weapon, which he took with him. This meant that the criminal was armed and possibly looking for another victim in the popular tourist area of the Grand Strand. The city's police, heavily reliant on tourism, could not afford another murder. They dedicated all their resources to finding the robber. The search led K9 units up to the road, but if the killer had a car, no one had seen it. Meanwhile, the police took Renee to the station, where they checked her hands for gunpowder residue as a precautionary measure. They didn't find any. The police had no reason to suspect her, but the entire scenario of what had happened was troubling. A random beach robbery was unusual in itself, but a robbery and murder on the beach was almost unheard of. The strangest part of Renee's story, from the police's perspective, was that she survived to tell it. If the robber decided to shoot his victim in the head to eliminate a potential witness, then why leave Renee alive? She wasn't even tied up, and she was not struck or gagged. Renee recounted that the gun clicked, as if there were no more bullets left. The casings found on the beach seemed to confirm her words. According to her account, it appeared that it was her lucky day. Meanwhile, the police had the difficult task of informing the parents of the 24-year-old young man that their son had been killed. Interestingly, the first thing the parents asked was whether his wife was with him. And then they revealed to the police the unusual dynamics of the marital couple. Growing up in the suburbs of Winston-Salem, North Carolina, Renee always had a way with guys. She caught Brent Bullseye in a serendipitous encounter in 1991 when they met in the school parking lot. A friend of Brent asked him to give Renee a ride home, and during that ride, Brent invited her on a date. Their whirlwind romance led to the news that they would become parents in March 1995, just 3 months after Renee turned 17. Brent proposed to Renee, traditionally getting down on one knee. Both of their families were unsure if they would be able to handle the responsibilities of parenthood. Fortunately, at 21 years old, Brent already had a promising career as a mechanic, working double shifts and making a decent income for a young man. Brent and Renee even managed to buy a small house in a residential area near Winston-Salem. At first glance, it seemed like things were going well for the young couple, but after the birth of their daughter in 1996, financial problems began to arise. To overcome their financial struggles, at Brent's suggestion, Renee took up a job as an exotic dancer at a local club in the spring of the following year. Brent was proud of his wife's job, and Renee enjoyed her new lifestyle. Her new job promised to help the family forget about their financial woes, with earnings ranging from $200 to $400 per night. However, Renee brought more than just cash home from the club. She became involved with some of her female co-workers, and according to rumors circulating in the club, Brent was supportive of these relationships. It seemed that he was open to experimenting in their marriage. But one of Renee's affairs turned out to be more serious than she had anticipated. In the spring of 1998, Renee began dating John Boyd Frazier, a computer systems technician and a DJ from the club. John was a pleasant young man, known for being generous with the ladies. Rumors suggested that this aspect of him was what attracted Renee to him. As Brent spent more time with his friends and, in Renee's opinion, didn't help her enough with their child, she decided to pack her bags, take their 2-year-old daughter, and move in with John. However, just a few days after the move, Renee met with a lawyer who explained to her that given her occupation as an exotic dancer and her relatively liberal views on relationships, she was unlikely to secure full custody of her daughter. This made Renee reconsider her decision to leave her husband. Renee packed her things and returned home to her husband. Brent, who was willing to do anything to keep Renee, welcomed her back with open arms. To celebrate their reconciliation, the whole family went on vacation to Myrtle Beach. The family vacation started off wonderfully, with them all enjoying a few days basking in the sun on the beach. However, on the evening of June 9th, on the 3rd anniversary of their wedding, Renee and Brent decided to spend the evening just the two of them. Renee had arranged for a babysitter for their daughter, Katie, at the hotel, but when the sitter arrived, their plans were almost derailed as Katie started crying. Brent tried to comfort their daughter, but Renee practically pushed him out of the hotel room. The couple visited 2 night spots, had dinner, and had a few cocktails. Then, a little after 11 o'clock, they decided to take advantage of the many secluded spots near their hotel. What happened next was known to the police. Upon learning the name of Renee's lover, the Myrtle Beach police called Salem to request an immediate visit to John's house and verify if he was there. They also spoke with Renee again. She confirmed the statements made by Brent's parents. Renee admitted that she had been involved with other men, including her affair with John, but claimed that all those affairs were in the past. However, she was uncertain if John agreed with her on this. Under pressure from the detectives, Renee admitted that she wasn't sure. By 5 a.m. on June 10th, Brent had been dead for 5 hours, and the Myrtle Beach police had a suspect in the murder, John Frazier. Detectives found out that he had called in sick to work on that day when he was supposed to be working. Unfortunately for the investigators, when they knocked on John's door, he was at home. It was almost impossible for him to travel to Myrtle Beach, commit the crime, return, change clothes, and then open the door for the police. The police had no choice but to apologize, wish him a good night, and leave. The police took up the investigation again with Renee. She came to the station accompanied by a lawyer, not a criminal defense attorney, but one who had helped her sister in her divorce. Renee repeated her story when suddenly her lawyer interrupted the conversation. He asked to speak with his client alone. But just when the investigators thought the conversation was over, they faced an unexpected surprise. Upon returning to the interrogation room, the lawyer instructed Renee to tell everything she knew. And Renee confessed that John was the one who pulled the trigger that night. She recognized him by his voice and mannerisms. Justifying herself, she claimed that she had to convince herself first that it was him. Now the police had to find out how John ended up on a secluded beach in another city on June 9th. Fortunately, a witness appeared at the right time. Bruce Wolford, a bartender at the club where Renee worked and John's friend, heard Renee talking to John about her plans to go to Myrtle Beach with her husband for their wedding anniversary. He also mentioned seeing John attempting to fight Brent on one occasion. In John's daily planner, the police found a note under June 9th that said Renee and Brent, although it was later discovered that he simply marked all the important dates of his friends and acquaintances. John was immediately arrested, but unlike Renee, he didn't give away a single word. The investigators believed that they would get the whole story from Renee. She made a mistake when she recanted her initial testimony. She was arrested right next to the funeral home and taken in for questioning. The detective did everything possible to extract information from Renee, even if it meant deceiving her. Although John Frazier refused to speak, the detective falsely told Renee that John had confessed to killing her husband at her request. They threatened her, saying that she would never see her daughter again unless she accused John of the crime and revealed where he had hidden the weapon. Gradually, after a 2-hour interrogation, Renee's story began to change. She confessed that she knew about John's threats to kill Brent but didn't take her lover's words seriously. The next day, Renee was accused of murder, and the prosecutor decided to insist on the harshest punishment for her. Her defense attorney, who specializes in criminal cases, demanded that she withdraw her confession. The case against Renee was essentially based on the fact that John was the shooter. However, the prosecutors faced serious difficulties. Apart from Renee's confession, they had no other evidence. To prove that Renee lured her husband out of the hotel room to set up John as the shooter, they needed a witness who could link her lover to the crime scene. And they found 2 witnesses right away. 2 elderly individuals were also staying at the same hotel as the couple and coincidentally celebrating their wedding anniversary there. On the day after the murder, they contacted the police to report that they had been on the beach the previous evening and saw a man dressed in black who frightened them. They identified John from a photograph, claiming that he appeared suspicious and they remembered his face. Although this statement immediately raised many doubts because it was nighttime and the beach had limited lighting, making it unlikely for them to clearly see a man at a considerable distance. Nevertheless, the prosecutors attempted to convict Renee, hoping that her accomplice would then admit guilt. Renee's guilt hinged on what she knew about John's plan. However, if John was not the murderer, then she had no connection to the crime at all. Detectives managed to pressure the shocked girl into confessing, which became the primary evidence against her in the case. Renee lost 15 pounds during this ordeal. They desperately needed a confession to prevent tourists from fearing to visit the city. It was crucial for them to portray Brent's death as something other than a random robbery. Renee's defense attorney believes that she was convicted for her lifestyle. However, the prosecutors argued that her lifestyle had a more significant impact on Brent. Being unfaithful to her husband and working in such a profession made divorce not an option for her. It seemed more logical to get rid of Brent. Her reunion with her husband was just one step in her fatal betrayal because being with her boyfriend during her husband's murder did not play in her favor. The jury deliberated for a long time and finally found the prosecution's arguments more compelling. Kimberly Renee Poole was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The trial of John, who had no intention of admitting guilt, took place shortly after that. He was sentenced to 30 years in prison despite the lack of actual evidence against him. The prosecutors didn't even call Bruce Wolford to testify. If Bruce had been a reliable witness, the prosecutors would have been eager to put him on the stand and convince the jury that John was the only person with a motive to remove Brent Poole from the picture. The problem was that there were several people who liked Renee and saw her husband as an obstacle, and Bruce Wolford was at the top of that list. Darrell Wilson, a private detective hired by John Fraser's mother, thoroughly investigated the case and came to the conclusion that Bruce was just as likely a suspect as John. The former police officer spoke not only with Bruce but also with many other witnesses involved in the case. In particular, he found Chris Hensley, another witness completely ignored by the police, who had a much better view and recollection of what happened on the beach that night. Firstly, He deduced what Renee and Brent were doing on the beach after seeing Brent's unbuttoned shirt. Secondly, he encountered a man dressed in black who passed very close to him, and Chris even greeted him out of politeness. According to Chris, the composite sketch based on his description didn't resemble John at all. However, when the private detective showed Chris a computer-generated composite and pictures of Bruce, Chris stated that the man in the photo matched the composite sketch very closely based on what he remembered about the person's height, hair, and face. Even more incriminating was the fact that Bruce had installed spyware on Renee's home computer, giving him complete control over her computer. This allowed him to monitor Renee's activities for 6 months, knowing everything about her whereabouts and plans, and reading all her emails and messages. Bruce became even more suspicious given that he owned a semi-automatic pistol and had access to a white van with a number sticker on the window, similar to the one witnesses saw on the beach before the murder. By killing Brent and framing John for the crime, Bruce could eliminate 2 rivals at once. After the trial, a campaign for the review of Renee's case began. Her new attorney filed an appeal on the grounds that her predecessor had performed poorly in her duties. The court-appointed public defender only met with Renee once before the trial, and that was just to push her to agree to a 30-year sentence in exchange for confessing to conspiracy to commit murder. The prosecutors implanted in the minds of the jury the idea that there was no robbery at all because approximately a month after the murder, Brent's wallet was found in the yard of a nearby house with $9 in cash, Brent's driver's license, and a bank card he used to pay for dinner at a restaurant. However, the defense attorney could easily prove that $50 were missing from Brent's wallet, which he had withdrawn from an ATM on the night of the murder to pay the babysitter. Moreover, the babysitter's testimony about Renee's alleged haste was misinterpreted. The babysitter could only sit with the child from 9 p.m. to 12 a.m., and she got lost, took some time to find the right hotel, and was 15 minutes late. Therefore, Renee was in a hurry to go for a walk with her husband just to spend more time with him within the 3-hour time frame allocated for babysitting. These are not all the facts that were not presented by the defense at the trial. In particular, there were electronic emails confirming that it was Brent who suggested going to Myrtle Beach. So, it wasn't Renee who lured her husband to a secluded beach. It was Brent who wanted to add some excitement to their intimate life, which is why they bought a beach towel on the way back from the restaurant at 10:52 p.m. Since they were supposed to go back home the next day, it was their last evening when Brent's desire could be fulfilled. Everything happened spontaneously. If it was premeditated, Renee would have taken a small towel with her to ensure nothing hindered the execution of her plan. Moreover, if the murder was planned, it would have been more logical for Renee to keep her husband in a secluded, wooded area until her accomplice arrived. However, the crime occurred as they were returning to the hotel. When they noticed a stranger following them, they hurried their pace. Brent even had time to draw his knife and potentially alter the situation in his favor. The Brent family has initiated an investigation along this path, claiming that Renee is responsible for everything. They have turned against her, blaming her for the moral choices their son made and desired. Renee's attorney should emphasize that Brent himself wanted her to work as a stripper and engage in relationships with other people, undermining the prosecution's theory. As Renee continues to fight for what is called mitigation of punishment after the verdict, she serves her sentence in prison. Brent's parents have been granted custody of Katie, although Renee managed to build a healthy and loving relationship with her daughter. In prison, Renee creates Braille textbooks for blind children, and her colleagues and supervisors highly value her work. To this day, she maintains her claim of innocence and insists that she does not know who robbed them with Brent and shot her husband.
Christmas 2017 didn't start off well for the Aguilar family from Elche, Spain. The family owns a bakery, so the holidays are the busiest time for their business. Spouses Rosa and Alberto Aguilar decided not to keep all the earnings at home and took them to the bank. But when Rosa approached the cupboard where the family kept the money, only small change fell out of the pouch. 6,000 or 7,000 euros were missing. The spouses were afraid they had been robbed, but the door lock was intact, and there were no signs of a break-in in the house either. Then they decided that perhaps their daughter Patricia knows more. Patricia Aguilar is the eldest child of Alberto and Rosa. 2 weeks ago, she turned 18. Patricia was a typical teenager, albeit a bit introverted and shy. She studied art and spent a lot of time in her room on the computer. Her parents were worried that she had few friends and was becoming reclusive. Therefore, Rosa was very happy when her daughter said she had been invited to a birthday party. The girl left with an overnight bag and has not returned since. Her parents wrote and called her, but she did not answer. They didn't know what to think. Considering that the money went missing at the same time as Patricia, Alberto decided to contact the police. But the police were confident she would return soon and didn't rush to find the 18-year-old girl. By evening, the issue of money no longer concerned the parents. They wrote to Patricia that they wouldn't scold her as long as she returned home. That night, they couldn't close their eyes. When they finally received the message, "Everything is fine, I will contact you in a few hours," from their daughter Alberto and Rosa didn't buy it. The message was not written in the way their daughter would have done it. Now the parents were convinced that something had happened. The most likely scenario seemed to them that the thief who stole the money had kidnapped the girl and taken her phone. Rosa couldn't sit and wait, knowing that the police were not taking any action, so she went into her daughter's room and searched through all her belongings. Every book, notebook, pillow, stuffed toy. She even looked under the lamp and behind the paintings. She realized she had found what she was looking for, although it was not at all what she expected. There were some esoteric symbols, descriptions of rituals written by Patricia's hand, and also clear instructions for a trip and marriage registration in Peru with descriptions of the necessary documents. Shocked, Rosa asked her husband if their daughter had run away to Peru to get married there, with whom. The police assured them that the girl had not crossed the country's borders. The plot thickened. Among her daughter's belongings, Rosa found photos of adult women she didn't know. Then for the first time, the thought crept into her mind that a cult might be behind all this, which she hurried to share with the police. But they dismissed her again, because 2 weeks ago the girl turned legal age and could do whatever she wanted. Weeks passed without any news, and Rosa and Alberto decided to turn to the public. They understood that the internet would be of invaluable help to them in this, but the Aguilar spouses were not familiar with it. They didn't even use social networks. Therefore, they turned to Noelia, Rosa's cousin. Patricia treated her as an older sister. Noelia responded in kind, and when her help was needed without hesitation, Noelia closed her shop in Benidorm and came to Elche. It was not difficult for her to find out that Patricia had been communicating a lot with some guy who sent her lists of books on black magic and esoterica. One word appeared particularly often in her notes: gnosis. As Noelia read, the concept of Gnosticism involves the search for knowledge, truth, but in the 1950s, several groups emerged claiming that allegedly to be saved in the apocalypse, one needed to cleanse oneself of sins. This could be done by engaging in intimate relationships as often as possible. Becoming carriers of such truth, the new followers of the doctrine had to renounce their families because other people were doomed, they were enemies. After finding all this out, Patricia's relatives realized that they didn't really know the girl and that she had been living a double life for a long time. A few more days passed, and Patricia got in touch. She wrote to Noelia that she was fine, but she wouldn't return, and attached a photo showing her holding a piece of paper with the date. She explained that she and her boyfriend were traveling in a mobile home across Europe, and they were currently in Petesti. But Petesti is in Romania, and the police assured them that the girl had not left Spanish territory. A quick search online told Noelia that on that day in Petesti, the temperature had dropped to -6 degrees Celsius, and the girl was wearing just a t-shirt. Noelia tried to call her back and found out that the girl's phone operator only serves South American countries. If, according to the police, Patricia had not left Spain, how did her phone do that? When Noelia tried to confront Patricia with this new information, she became agitated and rudely demanded to be left alone. But Noelia wasn't going to give up. In fact, the police were mistaken. On the very first day of her disappearance, when Patricia supposedly went to her friend's birthday party, she flew to Lima, Peru. After 2 years of online communication, she finally met her beloved, Stephen. He met her at the airport and immediately took her to a hotel. There, he became Patricia's first man. Thanks to the money she brought with her, they were able to rent a small apartment, where Patricia met 29-year-old Mariori Garcia Valverde and 42-year-old Paula Vega, the other, as he called them, wives of the man. Patricia knew she would become Stephen's third wife, but he didn't warn her that they would live with 4 children.
Paula's daughter and 2 girls and a boy from Mariori, so 8 people ended up living in a small apartment, and there was no space for intimacy, which they were supposed to engage in every day. Stephen and Patricia met 2 years ago. It was a very difficult time for the teenage girl. Patricia had an uncle, her mother's brother, Jose. He loved his niece very much, spoiled her, spent time with her when her parents were busy. For Patricia, he was both an older brother and a father figure. However, in 2015, 29-year-old Jose fell ill. He was diagnosed with pancreatitis. People recover from this illness, but complications arose in Jose's case. He passed away within 4 months. The whole family was devastated. While Alberto was able to fully immerse himself in work, his wife Rosa and Patricia couldn't cope with the pain of loss. Rosa developed depression and found solace in simple computer games that allowed her to distract herself. Unfortunately, during this time, she distanced herself from her children and husband, and Patricia, who needed the support of her loved ones more than ever, became very vulnerable. She began to ponder what happens after death, as she could not accept that death was the end. She became interested in this topic, visited relevant websites, and she met Stephen, a man with very developed communicative and manipulative abilities. He studied psychology books to know how to penetrate the consciousness of every person. He called himself a savior, a messenger facing the impending end of the world, apocalypse. He made naive girls believe that they were a couple in a past life and that his wives, his queens, had a mission to populate the world after the apocalypse. Stephen realized that Patricia was the perfect victim because she was a teenager and, as is often the case at that age, felt insecure and believed that nobody cared about her. All of this combined with her natural innocence. Stephen took advantage of her psychological vulnerability due to her uncle's death and used his persuasive methods to lure her into his traps. While her family was preoccupied, for 2 years Stephen worked on the girl's mind to isolate her, and no one noticed anything until it was too late. The girl believed she was safe because Stephen was on the other side of the globe. He gradually manipulated her, first asking for pictures in lingerie, then nude. Only after that did they discuss intimate moments, and the girl agreed that he had 2 wives. He explained this by saying that from a biological point of view, a man is created for relationships with many women, but a woman can only have one husband because a woman is a temple. Relationships with a man allow a woman to progress spiritually. A man can do this himself, but for a woman, this is the only way. And now, after 2 years of online communication, Patricia gave up everything and ran away to Stephen. He gave her a new name, Silvana, which means born in the jungle, but she had to get used not only to the new name. She had never taken forbidden substances, and Stephen made her consume a root that caused strong hallucinations. He didn't hesitate to give it to the children either. Meanwhile, the girl's family didn't give up trying to find her. They were lucky that Patricia left plenty of clues behind. Among her notes, Noelia found logins and passwords to computer games and social networks. One attracted her attention because it was repeated several times. Nicoli. It turned out to be the girl's secret page, where she expressed her thoughts about the afterlife. Among her friends, Noelia noticed a young man named Steven Martinez, and in his friends list there were only girls, 3,000 girls, all roughly Patricia's age. Noelia suspected that he might be behind all this. It was some progress, but for now, Noelia only found the guy's name on the internet. They needed evidence. Then the girl's mother searched Patricia's room again and noticed an interesting document. It turned out to be a medical certificate issued by a hospital in Lima, Peru, in the name of Paula Vega. Rosa realized they had stumbled upon a significant lead, finding Patricia's connection to Peru. The parents turned to the police, who passed the information to Interpol and eventually to the police in Peru. Stephen became nervous when the police called Paula and asked for clarification regarding Patricia. Even before Patricia's escape, he had asked her to forge a medical certificate for Paula. But instead of destroying the copy, she put it in a drawer in her room and completely forgot about it. And now they had problems. If Paula testified, the police would start digging deeper. Stephen decided to get Patricia out of trouble. They went together to the police station. Like a vulture, he watched her every word, controlling her every move. At his direction, the girl told the officers that nobody had kidnapped her and that she wanted to live in Peru. Since Patricia was of legal age, the police saw no crime. They simply let the couple go. This disappointed the girl's family, but at least they learned Stephen's full name, Felix Stephen Manrique Gomez, and they decided to change their approach, to turn to the media. This decision changed everything.
The Aguilar family wanted as many people as possible to learn about Stephen's methods, to prevent him from luring other girls into his cult. It was risky because Stephen could either send Patricia home or flee with her. As it turned out, Stephen chose the third option. As soon as he saw his face on the news program, he smashed all the phones and computers and kicked Patricia out of the apartment. He ordered her to contact the embassy, to get the opportunity to contact the media and fix everything. Until then, she would be alone on the street, without food or shelter. After a few days, she managed to reach out to a TV program and give an interview live. At first, her parents were relieved to see she was alive. But the things she said broke their hearts. The girl didn't hold back her words, aiming to hurt her parents to the core. She stated that she didn't want to know Rosa and Alberto because they were bad parents. Her father was never home. Her mother played computer games for days, and nobody paid attention to her, didn't feed her or buy her clothes. She considered her Uncle Jose as her real father, and essentially her grandmother raised her. Patricia demanded that they remove all information from the internet, all photos, messages about the search, and send her money. Only then would she send them her address. After that, she would decide what to do next. Finally, she told her father, "Do you know why I was so happy in the photos from my birthday? I dreamed of running away since I was 14, and now I finally could leave home." It was painful for the parents to hear this, and many of their acquaintances and even relatives believed the girl's words. After such a shocking statement, both the police and the media lost interest in the case. But her family didn't give up. Noelia decided to make the most of social media opportunities. She created a fake profile similar to Patricia's and requested to be friends with Stephen. She tried to portray herself as a teenage girl interested in esoterics, but perhaps she pressed too hard, asking for his phone number to communicate in Messenger. He suspected that she wasn't who she claimed to be, but mistook her for some Karen. He blocked her. But Noelia was already unstoppable. In Stephen's friend list, she found one Karen. It was a girl whose photo she had already seen among Patricia's belongings. Contacting her, Noelia learned that Karen had also been in the cult, but she managed to break free from Stephen's clutches. However, her sister Mai not only had been with him, but also was his only official wife. Karen confessed that she was afraid for her sister and advised reaching out to her mother Olinda. Perhaps she could help in some way. Despite Patricia partially managing to improve the situation with her interview, Stephen turned into a paranoid. He moved the girls and children to San Martin de Pangoa, a region 12 hours away from Lima by bus, in the middle of the jungle. It was a dangerous place with water and electricity shortages, and they could go weeks without bathing, both adults and children. There was also a lack of money for food. The meager coins they had were spent on candles and hallucinogenic roots that Stephen used during rituals. Patricia, now called Silva, deleted all her social media accounts, cut her long hair, and dyed it black. It was tough for the fugitives. A man with 3 women and 4 children, one of whom was clearly a foreigner. Cornered, Stephen became increasingly aggressive. He began mistreating Patricia very badly. Once he even told Mai, maybe we should just kill her, but it wasn't easier for the others. He severely beat the children and girls, using a leather whip, the effect of which was like being hit by 3 whips simultaneously. He beat the children for any reason, especially Mai's son, the only boy. Patricia got tired of this quickly and told Stephen that she would leave him, to which he threatened to take his anger out on the children. Despite the girls being willing to do anything for Stephen, even give their lives for him, he soon started asking for things that were beyond even their limits. Living nearby were girls who were rumored to be night butterflies despite their young age. Mai made the mistake of mentioning this to her husband. Stephen claimed that the girls would supposedly help him with a new ritual and demanded to arrange a meeting. But Mai couldn't do it because they were underage. She even considered Patricia too young for Stephen. The man became so enraged that he grabbed his wife by the neck and began to strangle her. She was almost suffocated and couldn't breathe. He would have killed her if Patricia hadn't intervened. Only then did Stephen release his victim. Patricia felt terrible, longing to return home to her parents but afraid of what they would say after all her actions. She lost her zest for life until suddenly everything changed. She realized she was expecting a child. Many advised the Aguilar family to forget about Patricia and stop searching, but her parents decided otherwise. Rosa stayed with her younger son in Elche, while Alberto went to Peru because they couldn't achieve much from Spain. But Peru was a large country, and Alberto was a stranger there, so he sought the support of Olinda, the mother of Karen and Mai. They found a prosecutor willing to help them, and the police began investigating, treating the case as one of human trafficking. The first place the officers visited was Patricia's apartment, from where Stephen had already taken her. Alberto could barely hold himself together when neighbors told stories of often hearing screams and blows and witnessing the girls being forced into intimate relationships in front of the children. Since Stephen had taken the children out of school and away with the girls in an unknown direction, detectives decided to track their phones. Stephen was horrified at the thought of being found, so the phones were almost always turned off. All they could do was wait for someone in the group to turn on their phone. Meanwhile, investigators found out who this Stephen was. The 35-year-old man was born in Lima into a poor and troubled family. He was bullied by other boys at school, which led him to spend time only with girls. From childhood, he learned how to manipulate them. His father gave him a book that helped Stephen join the Gnostics, but he was expelled because he drew ideas from other cults and called himself a prophet. Gradually, he came to found his own cult. When Stephen and the girls ran out of money, they moved to Alto Selindon, a tiny village with 30 houses. They settled into a hut right in the middle of the jungle. Mostly drug dealers and those avoiding the police, like them, inhabited the area. There was no water, electricity, or food in the hut. At best, they ate only rice and potatoes. Patricia was already 8 months pregnant, but due to severe malnutrition, it seemed like she was only in her 3rd month. The hut was surrounded by huge puddles, and everyone had to constantly wear boots. Fungal infections appeared on everyone's feet, even the children. Their feet were covered in insect bite marks, and their heads had colonies of lice. It was a disgusting place for them and the children, including the unborn ones, because Mai was also pregnant. Mai feared for her children's health. It was very difficult for her in such conditions. Despite her husband's prohibition, she turned on her phone and called her mother, just to hear her voice. The girl didn't even say anything, but it was enough for the police to trace the call. Detectives believed the fugitives were in Lima, but it turned out Stephen had taken them deep into the jungle. The police decided to send 2 officers to the region who knew the case best. They were given 10 days to search. They showed pictures of the group members to everyone passing by, assuming that the girl resembling Patricia would stand out among the other locals. The officers didn't know that she had not only changed her appearance, but also didn't have permission to leave the city. The police decided to go even higher into the mountains. Their persistence paid off. One girl they showed the pictures to recognized Paula. She described her as a strange woman in pink boots who returns home every evening across the bridge with a food package. The officers began to wait at the bridge, and the woman indeed appeared. She moved like a robot, not looking at anyone. The officers followed her. 40 minutes later, they went beyond the city limits and deeper into the forest. Finally, she entered a house where rooms were rented out. The police decided to rent a room in the house because otherwise they couldn't conduct surveillance. They were lucky. They got a room right next to Paula's. They could hear everything happening in the other room. They heard the voices of a man, Paula, and another girl. It turned out to be Mai. But Patricia or the children were not visible. The police did not take more decisive action because Stephen never left the room, not even to use the restroom, and they were not sure if it was him. Naturally, he didn't work. Paula and Mai did while the man lay in bed, and the officers were afraid that he simply wouldn't say where Patricia was. Suddenly, they overheard the man saying that tomorrow they would split up and leave one by one. Stephen planned to go even further to settlements of more wild indigenous tribes. Upon hearing this, the police officers called for backup to capture them. Knowing their schedule, they were able to apprehend group members one by one. Paula was stopped when she left for work early in the morning. Mai also left the house to do laundry. As for Stephen, when the police entered, he was lying on the bed as usual. The man resisted, introduced himself by another name, and pretended not to understand what was happening. To prevent him from stepping barefoot on the floor, pregnant Mai gave him her shoes. After that, he was forcibly removed from the hut. Fortunately, the girls immediately disclosed where Patricia was. By Stephen's command, Patricia and all the children remained in the hut as far away in the jungle as possible when Stephen, Mai, and Paula went to earn money, although Stephen, of course, didn't work. Patricia did everything around the house, took care of the children, and even worked on the plantation near the hut. She was there when the officers arrived. They called her by name. She had become so accustomed to the name Silvana that hearing Patricia felt unfamiliar. The officers believed they were rescuing Patricia and 4 children, but there were already 5. When Stephen, Paula, and Mai left for the city, Patricia begged not to be left alone, but Stephen was adamant, and predictably, at 8.5 months, she began having contractions. She screamed in agony. The children were with her but didn't know how to help her. At the girl's screams, a neighbor came. She was the one who assisted in the delivery. Patricia admits that she never thought she would give birth in the jungle at 19. The girl was extremely thin, looked exhausted when they rescued her, but even then she continued to think only about Stephen and the things he instilled in her. Meanwhile, Stephen was interrogated at the police station. An interesting fact emerged during the investigation. He was left alone with 2 colleagues briefly, and when they returned, one officer had already fallen under his influence. She claimed that Stephen was a prophet and they should help him, not arrest him. Immediately after Patricia, Mai, and Paula were rescued, they were separated as recommended by psychologists. They received assistance as victims of cults, sects, and dependent groups. It took them a long time before they started feeling better. They seemed to be in a lethargic state, but eventually, they woke up. The Aguilar family says that now everything that happened is in the past. They started anew, without accusations, without questions, without doubts. Patricia is still undergoing therapy and lives in her hometown with her parents and daughter. She received education in social rehabilitation and works in an organization that helps people with disabilities. Stephen was sentenced to 20 years in prison for human trafficking, sexual and labor exploitation. Many wondered how Patricia's parents didn't notice the changes in their daughter. Patricia was always a good student, but after her beloved uncle left her life, she started failing. Strangely enough, Stephen motivated her to study better, so they noticed changes in their daughter and they liked them. They thought she was coming to her senses. At that time, she was dating a boy from school whom her father didn't like. Alberto was happy when she dumped him. She stopped dressing in black, bought bright clothes, smiled more often, and asked to have a party for her 18th birthday. But her parents couldn't have known that all this was Stephen's demands. There were signs to pay attention to, but you never think that someone from another distant country will infiltrate your home through the internet and take away a family member. Dedication, obedience, detachment from the family happens very slowly, insidiously. It's in the cult's interest for their followers not to have loving and caring people around them. Everyone thinks that nothing like this will ever happen to them, but in moments of weakness, anyone can become vulnerable. Patricia Aguilar experienced firsthand what it's like to be isolated by a cult, taken out of her native country and taken away from her family. With her story, she wants to protect others from falling into the subtle mechanisms used by these false prophets. This case could have gone unnoticed by many, but became known thanks to Patricia's parents, who in their struggle to locate their daughter, managed to grab the attention of the media in different countries and share this story. 1990. 31-year-old Peggy Marshall was at the peak of her career. Armed with a degree in physical therapy, she founded a geriatric clinic in Newport Beach, California. Peggy was passionate about her work, enjoying helping her elderly patients, but what she truly longed for was love. Her dream came true that same year when she met 24-year-old volleyball player Eric Beckler. Peggy and Eric both loved sports, which became their shared passion. Just a few months after meeting, they became inseparable. They lived together in Peggy's apartment and worked together at her clinic. Eric handled the finances, while Peggy provided physical therapy services. Together they made a great team, and the business quickly grew, along with their bank account. Before this, Eric didn't have much of a career, but thanks to his girlfriend, his financial situation improved dramatically, and he enjoyed a stable and wonderful life in a great neighborhood. Soon after their magical wedding ceremony, Peggy Beckler learned that she was expecting a child. But the growing family didn't significantly change their lifestyle. The couple simply brought their daughter with them to the beach. Not long after their first child, a second arrived, and the family moved into a beautiful home they bought for $1 million. They hired 2 nannies, one for weekdays and one for weekends, especially since a third child had arrived. This was the big family Peggy had always dreamed of, like the one she grew up in herself. Thus, the 5th anniversary of the Becklers' marriage quietly arrived. On July 6, 1997, Gary Green, along with a large group of friends and family, was heading from Newport Beach to Catalina Island on his boat when he noticed a boat circling in the ocean. Nearby, a man on a surfboard was struggling in the water, calling for help. Gary Green threw him a life jacket to keep him from drowning and called the Coast Guard. When they arrived, they saw the boat displaying a phenomenon known as the Circle of Death. This happens when the person controlling the boat lets go of the steering mechanism while the engine is running and the propeller is still spinning. Ideally, the operator should be connected to a safety lanyard, which would immediately shut off the engine if they were thrown overboard. However, people often ignore this rule. So when the steering mechanism is released, the force of the spinning propeller creates torque, causing the boat to make sharp turns and continuously rotate in a circle. The Coast Guard was able to stop the boat. They also pulled the man from the water and brought him back to the harbor. He was freezing, panicked, and in tears. The man was Eric Beckler, and his wife, Peggy Beckler, had been on the boat with him. A rescue operation for Peggy immediately began. At that point, she had been in the water for less than 2 hours, and the Coast Guard was hopeful that the rescue would be successful. Peggy was an extraordinarily strong swimmer. At an early age, she was diagnosed with scoliosis and had to wear a back brace. She was only allowed to take it off while swimming, so she spent a lot of time in the water. Swimming became second nature to her. There was a very high chance that Peggy was at least keeping herself afloat while they searched for her. The key was to pinpoint her location as accurately as possible. To aid the rescue operation, the Coast Guard spoke with Eric. He was distraught, shaking, and crying, but he managed to explain that they had been celebrating Peggy's birthday and their 5th wedding anniversary that day. In the morning, he woke his wife up and announced that they were going to the beach. There, a surprise awaited her. Eric had rented a speedboat with a fairly powerful engine. However, it was easy to handle, even for beginners. The couple initially planned to swim in the harbor but soon grew bolder and ventured farther into the ocean for some excitement. For a couple with no experience in ocean boating, renting a speedboat and heading out into the ocean was quite ambitious. But they were enjoying their time. They had a picnic, drank margaritas, and made love. Eventually, they decided to head back. Peggy was at the helm, while Eric wanted to take one more ride on a boogie board. This type of surfing involves catching a wave while lying on your stomach on a relatively small board. As they approached the harbor, they were hit by what's known as a rogue wave or a killer wave, which completely engulfed Eric. When he resurfaced, Peggy was no longer on the boat. The boat itself was circling, making it impossible to get close. He couldn't swim away either, as he was still hoping to see Peggy on the water's surface. The Coast Guard officers were slightly puzzled by the fact that the weather conditions that day were surprisingly favorable for a sea trip. There were no waves and only a light breeze. They mentioned this to Eric, but he stood by his story. The investigators didn't argue. Although there had been no reports of rogue waves, they could have gone unnoticed. The ocean is an unpredictable place. Even in calm weather, many factors, wind, currents, tides, can combine to form unexpected, sometimes deadly waves. Hours passed. Evening came. But the Coast Guard helicopters and boats continued to search for Peggy. Even Navy submarines joined the search efforts. As night fell, confidence in a successful rescue began to fade. If the current had carried her away, she could have ended up in Santa Barbara or even Mexico. Peggy Beckler was searched for relentlessly for several days, but in the end, the difficult decision was made to call off the search. The Coast Guard focused on examining the boat. First, they made sure there were no mechanical issues that could have caused the accident. Then, they tried to recreate the situation the couple had been in. All the experiments showed that no matter how the boat rocked, the person steering it should have fallen inside the boat, not into the water. There was another odd detail. A pair of sunglasses was found near the steering mechanism. If Peggy had been swept away by a wave, the glasses should have fallen overboard, along with other items which should have been in disarray, but nothing of the sort was observed. Suspicion grew, and the Coast Guard asked the Homicide Investigation Department to look into the case. It was only later that forensic experts examined the boat. However, since the Coast Guard initially treated the case as an accident, most of the evidence had been lost. Under the mattress, the investigators found a small stain that looked like blood. The amount was too small to extract DNA or even determine the blood type. They couldn't even confirm if it was human blood or from a fish. Nevertheless, this didn't stop the investigators from questioning Eric about the discovery. Eric explained that his wife was on her period, and since they had been intimate, something could have gotten on the mattress. A reasonable explanation, but the detectives weren't ready to take his word for it. The boat was treated with luminol to detect traces of blood, and they found a whole pool of blood that had been carefully cleaned. It was invisible to the naked eye. Unfortunately, too much time had passed, and it was now impossible to determine when the blood had appeared or who had cleaned it up. Besides, Eric seemed so distraught over his wife's disappearance. No one believed that he could have killed his beloved wife. Moreover, there was another theory regarding her disappearance. Peggy and Eric had been spending too much money. Eric hadn't made mortgage payments on their home for several months, and their financial situation had deteriorated. But at that moment, Peggy caught a lucky break. She was approached by representatives of another company interested in buying her clinic because it had achieved great success. Peggy was faced with a tough choice. She didn't want to sell her clinic for any amount of money, as it was her life's work. However, her husband felt differently. He wanted to get rid of all their problems and difficulties, take the money, and not work. After giving in to his persuasion, Peggy agreed to sell the business. But luckily for her, the new bosses wanted both her and her husband to stay and continue working at the clinic. This was a great solution for them, but the situation didn't last long. The new owners uncovered fraudulent schemes through which the clinic had been receiving money from insurance companies for services it hadn't provided. During the period in question, Eric had been handling the finances, but his wife, as the clinic owner, took the fall. The new owners found this unacceptable and fired both of them. But losing her job wasn't the worst part for Peggy. Her clinic had been draining money from medical insurance providers for years, and someone had to be held accountable. She was facing charges of fraud and tax evasion. These are federal charges, and theoretically she could have faced 10 to 15 years in prison. Peggy confessed all this to Eric's mother, Linda. This is why Linda was convinced that Peggy had staged her own disappearance. She believed that Peggy, being a strong swimmer, had jumped overboard, easily swum to shore, and then settled somewhere in Morocco or the Caribbean. Linda thought Peggy would only return once the statute of limitations on the federal charges expired. At first, Eric's actions seemed to confirm her suspicions. He recovered surprisingly quickly after his wife's disappearance. He then sent their 3 young children to live with Peggy's parents, giving them full custody. But if anyone thought that Eric would soon try to disappear and join Peggy, they were mistaken. Just 3 months after his wife's disappearance, Eric was already dating someone new. Her name was Tina New, a model and actress who appeared in TV shows. As Eric quickly ran out of money, he decided to become a web designer. To promote his company, he planned to participate in a professional expo. He needed a model to attract attention, and a photographer friend from his volleyball team recommended Tina, whom he knew. The two hit it off right away. When Tina met Eric, she was struggling with substance abuse. Her car was in the shop, her home had no electricity due to unpaid bills, and the job offer from Eric came at just the right time. In her eyes, he seemed like a hero, a successful young businessman, so polite and courteous. So when he invited her to come home with him that same evening, Tina agreed. Eric's home was luxurious, with ocean views from every window. Almost every wall in every room was covered with family photos, many of them featuring Peggy. Eric didn't hide what had happened to his wife from Tina. Overall, he seemed like a perfect prince to her. So when the police contacted her to inform her that there was something suspicious about his wife's disappearance and asked her to inform them if she learned anything, Tina didn't believe them. The detectives left her their card, confident that once the initial charm wore off, she would call them, and they were right. Eric's new business failed after just a year, and he was catastrophically short of money to maintain the lifestyle he was used to. He lost his home, and he and Tina moved into a modest apartment. He also tried playing the stock market, but things didn't go well for him there either. The creditors were calling non-stop. Their relationship deteriorated significantly. They fought, reconciled, and fought again. It was October 1999. More than 2 years had passed since Peggy's disappearance. Tina and Eric had a fight so loud that the neighbors called the police. When the officers arrived, Eric was not in the apartment, and Tina handed them the detective's business card, asking them to call him. She told the arriving detectives that when they last spoke, she and Eric had just started dating. She was in love with him and believed the story he had told her. But now, she was certain that Eric had killed his wife. Tina told the detectives that a few weeks earlier, she and Eric had been at home, and she was watching old television shows that featured her. While fast-forwarding through the commercials, she suddenly stopped on a segment that had somehow been recorded. It was a news segment about the disappearance of Peggy Beckler. The news report discussed the water current and the weather on that day, which was completely inconsistent with what Eric had told her. Tina looked at him and said, "You lied to me." The blood drained from his face. He turned pale. Eric admitted that he had seen his wife fall overboard but hadn't been able to swim to her in time. Tina asked if he couldn't or didn't want to. He replied, "I couldn't." Then he thoughtfully added, "Or maybe I didn't want to." A bad feeling began to creep over Tina, but she decided to brush the conversation aside. A couple of weeks later, Tina and Eric were relaxing at a club where they were using illegal substances. When they returned home, they were lying in bed, still not fully recovered, when Tina suddenly exclaimed, "Oh my God, you hit her in the head." She didn't even understand why she realized this so clearly. Eric even jumped. He asked, "How do you know that?" But she didn't know until he confirmed it with those words. Tina demanded to know how it all happened. It turned out that the day before the boating trip, Eric had prepared a cooler, dumbbells, trash bags, and everything needed for margaritas. Eric told Peggy that it was a surprise, so she didn't even look into the bag. They went out into the ocean. Peggy was just lying there, relaxing, sunbathing, when her husband approached her from behind and, according to him, hit her so hard that she didn't even feel it. Then the murderer folded his wife's body in half, tied her ankles, wrists, and neck together, put 2 trash bags on Peggy, and dumped her into the water with a weight of 30 kilograms. After that, he returned to the boat several kilometers closer to shore. This meant that the Coast Guard, helicopters, and submarines were all searching for Peggy in the wrong place. Tina told the police all of this, but her words weren't enough for even an arrest of Eric because she could simply be making false accusations against her ex-boyfriend. However, this wasn't the first time detectives had heard similar allegations against Eric. They had heard the same from his best friend, Kobe Laker. A few months after the boating incident, Eric's friend, Kobe Laker, went to the police with a lawyer. Kobe had already been questioned before, but now he confessed that he had lied when he told the police that the couple had a perfect relationship. Eric had repeatedly confessed to his friend that he was fed up with his wife and could no longer tolerate her. Eric considered his wife controlling and demanding. On the other hand, she was carrying the weight of the children and the business, while he just wanted to play volleyball with his friends. She brought money into the household, and he was happy to spend it. All of this Eric had shared with Kobe. One day, Eric directly asked his friend what he would think if Eric killed his wife. Allegedly, Eric was considering taking her out into the ocean and dumping her in the water in a barrel or something similar. When Kobe regained his speech, he asked if he was joking, and Eric replied, "Maybe." Kobe stated that he hadn't mentioned this before because he was scared and wanted to protect his friend. Thanks to the young man's testimony, the police officially classified the case as a homicide. But without physical evidence, including the victim's body, investigators couldn't proceed. They needed to get Eric to confess on tape. Kobe agreed to wear a recording device and meet with Eric, but he couldn't get his friend to open up. Eric remained calm and insisted that Peggy had indeed had an accident. The police had only Kobe's word against Eric's. That wasn't enough for an arrest. By the time Kobe testified, the police had long given up on the idea that Peggy had faked her disappearance to avoid fraud charges. In reality, she faced a maximum fine, not prison time, so it was unlikely she would have abandoned her beloved husband and children to hide in another country. Therefore, the police now suggested that Tina try to get Eric to talk so they could record his words and arrest him. She agreed because she was openly afraid of her boyfriend. On October 29, 1999, the police placed a listening device on the girl's back and another in her handbag. Tina and Eric met at a restaurant, with detectives positioned both inside the restaurant and outside in the parking lot. The girl was supposed to act confidently, but she was afraid that Eric would hug her and feel the device on her. Eric and Tina had a couple of cocktails, after which Tina got down to business. She told Eric that the police had come to her asking questions about Peggy's disappearance, so they needed to agree on how she would respond. The man simply replied that she hadn't been on the boat. That was all she needed to say. But that answer didn't satisfy Tina. She had always known that if anyone could get Eric to talk, it would be her. So she asked how it had come to this. Why didn't he just divorce his wife? Eric replied that he would lose money in a divorce and would never see his children again. His wife would take them away and wouldn't let him see them. But who was he fooling? Tina knew very well that as soon as Peggy disappeared, he had given custody of the children to her parents. Still, that was something. Tina continued to press. She asked how she could be sure he wouldn't do something similar to her if they continued to date, to which he replied that he would never do that again. This was not enough, but still sufficient for Eric's arrest. The detectives, of course, did not hear a confession from him because he demanded a lawyer, but when they searched him, they found a weight bench that was missing only the 15-kilogram weights. Together, they accounted for the 30 kilograms he had mentioned to Tina. The trial began. This was a unique case because the prosecution had no physical evidence of the man's crime or that Peggy was even dead. Moreover, Eric acted very cleverly, confirming that during his conversation with Tina, he meant the murder of his wife. However, he claimed that she liked bad boys and that he was trying to create that image. The prosecutor was well prepared and used all circumstantial evidence to convincingly demonstrate his version of the events of that day. Furthermore, the motive for the murder was indisputable and as old as time. Both spouses were insured for more than $2.5 million. Today, that would be the equivalent of nearly $4 million. This issue clearly concerned Eric because 3 months before Peggy's disappearance, he called her brother to inquire about the money. He wanted to know more about the policies and how the payout would work if something happened to his wife. Interestingly, a month and a half before her death, Peggy wanted to change the beneficiary of the insurance. She intended to exclude Eric so that the money would go only to the children. This indicates how little she trusted her husband in her final days. Of course, Eric did not receive the insurance payout anyway, because insurance companies are very reluctant to pay money to potential suspects. After 7 days of deliberation on February 1, 2001, Eric was found guilty of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. After his wife's death, Eric did not receive the insurance money. Instead, he lost his home and income, and his new business failed. Indeed, Peggy was far more valuable to her husband alive. She was his ticket to a luxurious life, and even in the case of a divorce, he would have gained more than nothing. But evidently, he did not understand that, not to mention the fact that murder itself is a terrible crime. Overall, he did not act very sensibly. No wonder his volleyball buddy said he must have had an accomplice because he was too foolish to come up with everything on his own. Not to mention that the police had no evidence, but his long tongue led to him spending the rest of his life in prison instead of playing volleyball on the beach. On March 1, 2011, at 2 o'clock in the morning, Gisela Daoud heard her phone ringing. An unknown number appeared on the screen. It was a police officer from the city of Valence, asking if she was the mother of Samira Ben-Saad. She answered yes. Gisela couldn't understand why the police were looking for her 20-year-old daughter, Samira. She hadn't seen her for 3 days. The woman demanded an explanation of what was happening, but the police response did not calm her at all. The caller stated that they were searching for Samira because her boyfriend, 22-year-old Maël Combia, had gone missing. The police had discovered that the young couple had been dating for 8 months. However, Gisela knew nothing about the guy. Samira and Maël had met at a party. Samira Ben-Saad was a very beautiful woman who was aware of her attractiveness. She wanted to become a model and loved posing for photographs. Maël, in turn, was also a very nice and pleasant young man. There was an immediate mutual attraction between them, and they started seeing each other. However, on February 28, 2011, at 9:45 p.m., Maël's boss from the construction company contacted the police. He was worried because he hadn't heard from his employee for 3 days. On Saturday morning, the guy came to work, and then his phone rang. He quickly got up and left without any explanation, and no one had seen him since. On Monday morning, his boss was surprised that he still hadn't shown up. They considered him a punctual and responsible employee, and it was the first time he didn't come to work. His boss found out that Maël wasn't answering calls from colleagues and friends, so he decided to contact the police. First, the police went to the guy's home in the city center of Valence, but it yielded no results because no one answered the doorbell. His car was not at the house either. On the same evening, the police talked to Maël's mother. She hadn't received any news from her son for 3 days and added that during their last meeting, he had behaved very unusually, being extremely emotional and tense. The woman mentioned that her son hugged and kissed her and said he loved her, something he had never done before. The details uncovered by the investigators seemed very suspicious. Maël and Samira disappeared on the same day without explaining anything to anyone and had not contacted their families for 3 days. It couldn't be a coincidence.
One clue came from examining their phones. The investigators found out that Samira and Mael didn't just leave at the same time, but they left together in Mael's car. The phone pings revealed that on Saturday, in the middle of the day, they headed to Nice, and in the evening, they checked into a luxury hotel on the promenade. The investigators contacted the hotel and learned that there were surveillance cameras capturing two guys and a woman. The description perfectly matched Samira and Mael. They left Nice on Sunday morning and arrived in Livorno, 400 kilometers east of the border between France and Italy, by the evening. The young couple was clearly heading further into Italy, and the French police sought assistance from their Italian colleagues. Mael had booked a room in a prestigious hotel in Livorno. The hotel staff confirmed that a guy and a woman matching the description of the missing couple had stayed with them. So, Saturday evening was spent in Nice, and the next day they headed to Livorno. Everything indicated that Samira and Mael had embarked on a spontaneous romantic journey, especially considering that the Riviera was conducive to such adventures. The detectives believed that the young couple would soon return home together, and they had no reason to doubt this theory, especially since Samira's mother received a message from her daughter stating that she had left, but there was no need to worry because she would return soon. It seemed like it should have been another confirmation that everything was fine with the young couple, but Gazella was certain that her daughter would never disappear just by impulsively leaving for a trip. Samira was a responsible woman who never missed work. There was another detail that troubled Gazella. She couldn't understand how her daughter, who loved being photographed and never left the house without meticulously applied makeup, styled hair, and carefully chosen clothes, could go away for several days with a young man without taking any belongings with her. She was also puzzled by the fact that Samira sent an SMS. The thing is, she would usually just call her mother. They were close and could talk for hours, so receiving a text message didn't calm her down. Instead, it only worried her even more. The next news about the case came from the city of Imperia, located in northern Italy, approximately 80 kilometers from Nice. On Monday, March 3, 2011, Massimo Bessone was on his way to work when he turned onto a small street to take a shortcut. Along the road, he noticed something strange. At first, he thought he saw a mannequin, but when he opened the door, he realized it was a woman. Massimo shouted something but received no response. However, the woman was clearly moving. He quickly called for an ambulance. Italian police determined that she was the missing French woman. Someone had shot her in the back of the head, and the bullet had lodged in her skull. The theory of a romantic trip could now be discarded. The French police were perplexed. Initially, it was a case of suspicious disappearance, then they thought it was a love-related escape, but now they were dealing with a girl who had been wounded in an attempted murder. Samira was alive but in critical condition. She was immediately taken to the hospital, and her mother was informed. When Gazella arrived at the hospital, she didn't even recognize her own daughter at first. It's difficult to describe the sight. Samira's head was shaved bald, and she resembled a 9-year-old child. The woman refused to believe that her daughter ended up in Italy with a bullet in her head. The doctors told the mother that there was little hope since the bullet was lodged in her daughter's skull. But Gazella didn't want to accept that and arranged for Samira to be transported to a hospital in Marseille. There, a surgeon informed her directly that he would perform the operation but wouldn't provide false hope. Even if the patient survived, she would never fully recover. Samira underwent a 10-hour operation. Although she made it through the surgery, when she opened her eyes, she didn't recognize anyone and couldn't speak. She had to relearn everything like a young child. While Samira couldn't tell anything about what happened in Italy, the police had to search for the culprit without her testimony. Many indications pointed to the crime being planned. She was found lying on the side of the road near a landfill, and the Italian police couldn't find any of her belongings. There was no purse, no phone, no passport. This indicated that the perpetrator wanted her to remain unidentified. However, the investigators had a lead. The last person Samira was seen with was her boyfriend, Mael Combia. The police believed that Mael crossed the border into Italy to commit the crime and then fled. However,
He made a mistake by using his bank card in France after Samira was found. He used it at a first-class hotel in Les Tourrex, just 35 kilometers from his apartment in Valence. Surveillance cameras showed that Maël had returned to France a day earlier. But if he was innocent, why didn't he go home to his family? Instead, he stayed in a hotel just a few kilometers away. Soon, he made another mistake. Investigators discovered that he had used Samira's credit card. In other words, the young couple embarked on a spontaneous trip to another country where the woman nearly died, and Maël stayed in a hotel and used her card. Everything confirmed the police's worst suspicions. To search for a motive, the detective spoke with the family and friends of the young man. It became clear that Samira and Maël's relationship was far from perfect. Samira was a very beautiful woman, and many men showed interest in her, which bothered Maël. Their arguments often escalated into physical violence. Maël could slap Samira in front of their friends, and there was even an incident where he extinguished a cigarette on her. Obviously, he couldn't be considered a very stable person, but the question of the motive remained open. Did Maël act in a fit of rage, or was everything planned in advance? All their friends knew that Samira was infatuated with Maël despite his behavior. However, she recently found out that her boyfriend was married. He had gotten married to his girlfriend at the age of 18 and frequently cheated on her. Samira was far from being his only mistress. She was angered by the revelation but didn't break up with him because she believed Maël's claim that they were in the process of divorce and living separately. Upon discovering this, the investigator went to Maël's home. But as soon as he entered, he realized that Samira was mistaken and the husband and wife were clearly living together. Furthermore, Maël was soon to become a father. The apartment had 17 ultrasound photos with the name Combia written on them. It was evident that Maël, his wife, and Samira were involved in a love triangle, and one of them was destined to disappear. It was necessary to find Maël, and it turned out to be much easier than the police had anticipated. Maël Combia surrendered himself 5 days after the disappearance, appearing at the Valence police station on March 4th. This was an incredible stroke of luck for the investigation. Maël not only came to the station voluntarily but also directly confessed that he was the one who shot Samira. He then proceeded to recount what had happened. The young man claimed that Samira was just an acquaintance with whom he could spend pleasant time. Their relationship had no future, and she knew it. Maël explained that their romance had come to an end, but Samira couldn't accept it. She didn't give him a moment's peace, constantly calling him and sometimes dialing his number 150 times in a single day. He showed the investigator his phone, which displayed evidence that Samira had called him approximately 1,000 times in a month. Maël's words confirmed that Samira's behavior could be classified as stalking. But could this be considered a justification for shooting her? Soon, the situation escalated to the point where the young man feared for his life. He recounted what happened on the Friday evening before their departure to Italy. Samira confronted him in a nightclub while he was kissing another woman. She stormed out of the club, scratched his car with her key, and they began arguing, which escalated into a fight with Samira's cousins. This incident terrified Maël because they claimed to have weapons and threatened to kill him. Maël was in a panic. He quickly got into his car and left the nightclub, deciding that he needed to come up with a way to protect himself in the future. The idea of acquiring a weapon for his own defense crossed his mind. The next day, when he received the call, he impulsively left and went to buy a revolver. However, all of this still didn't explain why he shot Samira. Maël explains that he didn't go to Italy to kill her or commit any other terrible act. He simply wanted to put an end to their troubled relationship. He drove Samira to Italy to calm down their heated emotions and explain everything to her. But things didn't go as planned. They argued again in the car, and Maël got out. Samira followed him. According to Maël, he grabbed the weapon with the intention of scaring her but had no intention to shoot. However, the revolver went off accidentally. Afterward,
He left her lying on the ground, got back into the car, and drove away. When asked why he didn't call for an ambulance, he said he was scared when she fell. He went into hiding for several days because he didn't know what to do. The rest of the story was already known to the police. Overall, the man claimed that he was the victim of his obsessive lover's pursuit, and what happened in Italy was an accident. He was arrested for attempted murder, but his explanation didn't fully convince the police. Some pieces didn't fit together. Why would someone travel to another country and stay in a luxury hotel just to end a relationship? Why did he take all her personal belongings and then use her credit card? And who sent the message to Samira's mother from her daughter's phone? The investigator had no doubt that the young man was lying, but it was difficult to prove without Samira's testimony. Fortunately, over time and with therapy, Samira was able to provide her testimony. At first, with a weak voice and very slowly, Samira began to speak. On October 11, 2011, 8 months after the attack, she recounted her version of events. Samira's words contradicted the claims of her former lover. He came to her home, stating that they needed to talk. She didn't want to, but he insisted, so she relented. Maëlle invited her for a weekend getaway. She asked where he wanted to go, and he replied, Spain. This didn't sit well with her, so he took her to Nice instead, and from there, they went to Italy. After 2 days of leisure, on the 3rd day of the trip, Maëlle unexpectedly veered off the road. When asked why he turned onto a road leading to a landfill, he reassured her not to worry because he simply needed to dispose of something. Maëlle stopped the car and got out. He opened the passenger side door for her to exit and retrieved a revolver. Pointing it at her, he declared that she would die. "Shoot if you're a man," she exclaimed, and he fired the gun. On February 7, 2012, a year after the attack on Samira, forensic experts found the revolver, and this discovery completely refuted Maëlle's claims. According to his version, the gun in his hand unexpectedly went off. However, ballistic analysis showed that such an event could not have occurred. The expert explained that before firing, the shooter needs to carefully prepare, pull the trigger back and then shoot, which involves 2 distinct actions. You cannot simply wave your hand for the revolver to fire. Furthermore, to pull the trigger of the revolver backward, one needs to hold the weapon with one hand and apply significant force to accomplish the action with the other hand. Accidentally firing such a firearm was utterly impossible. Maëlle Combia lie. He wanted to kill Samira, and after several months of investigation, detectives were able to reconstruct the plan that the murderer had conceived. On February 26, 2011, at 9 a.m., Maëlle left work. He was determined to avoid a repeat of the previous night's scene at all costs, so he purchased a weapon. Heading to the woods, he tested it, loaded it, pulled the trigger, and fired. He had planned everything. After a romantic weekend in Italy, Samira was supposed to disappear on the other side of the border. Italy served as the perfect country to commit the crime since he had no connections there. Driving off the road, Maëlle pulled the woman out of the car, declared he would kill her, and shot her. Then he took her belongings to prevent her identification. Returning to France, Maëlle attempted to mislead the police by sending an SMS to Samira's mother. Everyone was supposed to believe that the woman had gone on a trip and was still alive. The guy believed he had committed the perfect crime and was confident that he would never be caught. Imagine his surprise when he discovered that his victim had survived. While the police were searching for him, he spent 5 days hiding near his hometown, contemplating his next actions. He lacked the means and useful connections to escape, so he devised a new strategy for self-defense. Maëlle Combia decided to go to the police and present his version of events. On February 10, 2014, the trial of Maëlle began in the city of Valence. The trial was a real ordeal for the victim and her family. To their immense surprise, Maëlle did not deviate from his version of events. He insisted that he was the victim in this case, and Samira had been harassing him, and everything that happened in Italy was an unfortunate accident. His friends stated that he had never been an aggressive person and purchased the revolver out of fear after threats from Samira's cousins, who had threatened to destroy his apartment, car, and kill Mael himself. He hid nothing and went on a trip to Italy in his own car, taking his phone with him. He simply wanted to take the woman on a trip to calm her down, as he was emotionally exhausted from Samira's constant call. It is also worth noting that Mael conducted himself with exaggerated politeness and respect during the trial, effortlessly charming the jury, and his strategy paid off. He was sentenced to 13 years of imprisonment. The lenient sentence made many wonder if there was a connection between Mael's behavior in court and the relatively short duration of the sentence chosen by the jury. After all, people often associate criminals with unpleasant personalities, and it is difficult for them to convict a charming young man with excellent manners. Samira considers this punishment too lenient, as by the time he turns 40, he will be a free man, able to live a normal life, while she will forever remain bound to a wheelchair simply because she loved a man who decided to kill her. The surgeon explained that during 1 year of therapy, Samira regained 80% of her abilities, after which the effectiveness of rehabilitation sharply declined, leaving her dependent on the help of others for the rest of her life. She admits that she was willing to do anything for love, and this is how he repaid her. The story of Tim and Charlene's meeting resembled a romantic fairy tale. Two intelligent, attractive, and successful young individuals were ready for marriage and, upon meeting each other, immediately understood that their union was meant to be. Over the course of 3 years, they tied the knot, moved into their own home, and welcomed a little daughter into their lives. However, after the arrival of their child, money became tight for the family, so Tim and Charlene decided to sell their beloved pickup truck and buy a simpler car. In May 2013, Charlene posted an online ad, and now she nervously paced the room of her house. Tim had been gone for over an hour, and she was starting to panic. Even if the men had decided to take the car for a test drive, they had been gone for too long. Charlene called her husband multiple times, but all the calls went to voicemail. He hadn't responded to her messages. Although she knew for certain that Tim had charged his phone before leaving for work, when he still hadn't returned late into the night, Charlene called the police to report her husband's disappearance. The Hamilton police took the disappearance of the 32-year-old man very seriously. Canine search teams and search and rescue teams were deployed, not to mention the hundreds of Ancaster residents who joined in the search efforts. Despite the community's involvement in the search, many suspected that the man had simply run away, possibly due to a disillusioned life or accumulated debts. However, the detectives found no evidence to support these theories. The police organized a press conference where Charlene directly addressed the abductors, pleading for them to release Tim and emphasizing the need for their little daughter to have her father, and for her, a husband. Barely holding back tears, she added, "It was just a car, just a silly car." It was only when Charlene uttered those words that everyone realized, all at once, that the car was the very reason for the man's disappearance. And thus, anyone could become a victim simply because they decided to sell their pickup truck. 3 days later, Tim's phone was found. It was discovered by a worker in the grass near a construction site, approximately 20 minutes away from Hamilton. However, there was no sign of Tim or his pickup truck nearby. The discovery of the phone itself was not significant since the police had already obtained all the necessary information from the telecommunications company. Detectives started investigating the phone number from which potential buyers of the pickup truck had called Tim. It turned out that the phone was registered under a false name and address. But Tim was not the only one listed in the outgoing calls. The persistence of the criminal who had used the number multiple times led the police to Igor Tumenenko, an Israeli army veteran who was selling a similar Dodge Ram and had posted an advertisement online. Igor told investigators that he had taken a test drive with 2 men just 2 days before Tim's disappearance, but unlike Tim, Igor had returned home after the drive. Perhaps it was because Igor was a tall, robust former soldier who could resist attackers if necessary. But most importantly, Igor provided the investigators with a description of the men, mentioning that the tall guy had a small bag slung over his shoulder and a tattoo on his wrist that read ambition. During the subsequent press conference, the police shared the description of the two men with journalists, and within 2 days, colleagues from Toronto contacted them, claiming to know exactly who the Hamilton police were looking for. They identified the wanted man as a young millionaire, playboy, and one of Canada's most eligible bachelors, 27-year-old Dylan Millard. Long before the police took an interest in him, Dylan Millard was a young prodigy. At the age of 14, he made headlines as the youngest Canadian to pilot a helicopter and an airplane on the same day. Born in 1985 to Wayne and Madeline Millard, Dylan was the heir to the multi-million-dollar airline company, Millard Air, founded by his grandfather. However, by the time he turned 20, the guy dropped out of university and led a rather idle lifestyle. Dylan threw poolside parties, drove the most luxurious cars, and was always surrounded by glamorous women. He allowed his friends to live in his numerous houses and apartments, and he moved so frequently that some of the household staff never even met him. 2 months before the events described, his father unexpectedly passed away, leaving Dylan as the inheritor of the family fortune. According to his friends' estimates, it ranged from $10 to $20 million. It was hard to believe that a millionaire with a garage full of luxurious cars would be capable of kidnapping someone over a pickup truck. The police put Dylan under surveillance and discovered that he was friends with an employee of the airline named Mark Smick. Unlike Dylan, Mark did not come from wealthy parents. In fact, he made a living by selling illicit substances. However, what was of greater importance to the police was the extensive list of criminal offenses associated with Mark. At the same time, by comparing the footage from several surveillance cameras, the investigators pieced together the events of that evening. Shortly after the pickup truck left Tim's house, a dark SUV can be seen closely following it in the video. Dylan was behind the wheel of one vehicle, while Mark was driving the other. It cannot be stated with certainty, but Tim was likely already dead. Half an hour later, the cars stopped, and the criminals changed the license plates of Tim's pickup truck to avoid police detection. Now that they had obtained the desired pickup, their next task was to get rid of its owner. At 2 a.m., they arrived at the Millard Air hangar. The pickup was towing a large trailer with some heavy equipment on it. Mark and Ellen entered the hangar, and soon sparks and flames started to emerge from the equipment on the trailer. This mysterious fire would burn throughout the night. Early in the morning, when Tim had been missing for 12 hours, Millard Air employees received a message from Dylan instructing them to stay away from the hangar. Arthur Jennings, an employee of Millard Air, recalls that the demand was explained to him as company policy. On Tuesday, he obediently avoided entering the hangar, but on Wednesday, he came across a pickup truck identical to the one described in the news. The man didn't know what to do. Deciding to photograph the vehicle and its identification number, he dialed the anonymous crime reporting hotline and requested it to be checked. They confirmed that it was the same vehicle. The man was so shocked that he felt physically ill. Fearing for himself and his family's lives, he only reported what he had learned on Friday. By that time, the pickup truck was no longer in the hangar. Fortunately, thanks to the phone data and Igor's testimony, the police already had a suspect. On May 11th, 4 days after Tim's disappearance, Dylan was arrested by the Hamilton police. Charlene was relieved, thinking that her husband would now be found quickly. She didn't know that the police no longer expected to find him alive. Acting on a tip from neighbors, officers arrived at Dylan's mother's house, where they discovered the pickup truck in a large trailer on the driveway. The pickup had been partially dismantled and meticulously cleaned, but despite that, they found Dylan's fingerprints and traces of blood inside. The keys to the pickup are still hanging on Dylan's keychain. But what about the equipment that the pickup was towing that night? The police searched all of Dylan's apartments and homes. On his farm, they found an industrial incinerator for burning various types of waste. This huge furnace was the very equipment from which sparks of flame were seen on the night of Tim's disappearance. Inside the furnace, forensic experts found small bone fragments, including human teeth. Due to the intensity of the fire, obtaining DNA was impossible. However, it is presumed that the bones belonged to Tim, and on May 14th, the police officially announced his death. Astounded by their findings, the investigators wondered if there could be other victims among Dellen's acquaintances. They continued to search Dellen's farm, but by that time the Toronto police had already missed 3 crucial clues, each of which could have saved Tim. The first was the mysterious disappearance of 23-year-old aspiring actress Laura Babcock. By the time arrests were made in connection with Tim's murder, Laura was already missing for about a year. She had met Dellen at a pub in Toronto. They dated for no more than a month, after which they remained friends, although romantic encounters still occurred. In 2010, Laura met Sean Lerner. Sean was a complete opposite of Dellen, and he was clearly in love with Laura. Although their relationship ended after 18 months, they remained friends. After graduating from college, Laura had difficulty getting her life together. She was depressed, had arguments with her parents over their house rules, and found herself practically homeless, staying with friends. To make ends meet, Laura turned to the escort industry. Upon learning about her friend's difficulties, Sean paid for a motel room where Laura could stay with her pet and provided her with an iPad to search for more conventional work. It was Sean Lerner who organized a party for Laura's 22nd birthday, inviting Dellen and his future girlfriend, Christina Nuga, among others. Clearly, it was this love triangle that led to the tragedy. Laura continued seeing Dellen behind Christina's back, but Christina likely suspected something, and on Laura's 23rd birthday, she sent her a message saying, "Happy birthday." It has been exactly a year since Dellen and I became intimate. Laura immediately retaliated, saying, "Great, and I was with him 2 weeks ago." This message genuinely upset Christina about her boyfriend's infidelity. Dellen had to assure her that he would deal with Laura, promising Christina, "First, I'll hurt her. Then I'll make her leave. I'll remove her from our lives." On July 3rd, 2012, Laura went home to her parents and left her dog, suitcase with belongings, and a shoebox containing approximately $1,000 in cash. She then went to the subway station, where Dellen picked her up and drove her to his home. At 7:03, Laura made a call to check her voicemail, and her phone connected to a tower near Dellen's home. After that, her phone stopped working completely. At 7:30, Dellen informed Mark that he was on a mission and would return in an hour. The next day, Laura's iPad was connected to Dellen's computer, and its name was changed to Mark's iPad. Afterward, Dellen took a picture of an object wrapped in blue tarp. In light of the events that unfolded, the photo speaks for itself. Dellen asked a worker from his aviation company to build a massive furnace for him, but when that experiment failed, he ordered a waste incinerator. On July 23rd, he sent a message to Mark stating that the barbecue was hot and ready for meat. Dellen's internet search history during that time revealed his interest in the effective temperature for cremation. Finally, he took a photo of Mark with the pipe from the incinerator and filmed the flames erupting from it. On July 14th, Laura's family and Sean Lerner reported her disappearance to the police, but upon learning about her recent mental state and profession, the officers didn't pursue her case, assuming she would return on her own. However, Sean refused to let the matter rest. He obtained a printout of Laura's recent calls and conducted his own investigation. It didn't take him long to discover that the last 8 calls from her phone were made to Dellen Millard. Sean called Dellen, who initially ignored the calls but eventually agreed to meet him and discuss the situation. Dellen claimed that Laura had asked him for illicit substances but didn't receive them. He then told Sean not to hope to see her again. Sean relayed all the information he had gathered to the police, presenting them with Dylan Millard's name on a silver platter. However, the detectives once again refused to take any action. Laura's case was forgotten, but a year later, when Sean heard about Dylan's arrest for murder, he quickly connected the dots and convinced Laura's family to call the Hamilton police. Unlike their counterparts in Toronto, the Hamilton officers showed great interest in their story. After the arrest of the men, Laura's iPad and her sports bag with her name and address written by her hand were found at Mark's house. In addition to incriminating photos on the iPad, investigators found a video in which Mark raps and essentially confesses to burning the girl's body and throwing her phone into the river.
Outside the home, and if you go swimming, you can find the phone.
Laura was still considered missing in November 2012 when the Toronto police missed two crucial leads. They were of a slightly different nature, but equally important to the case. An online advertisement for a motorcycle appeared, and just a few days later, its owner, Marty McDougall, came home to find that both the motorcycle and its trailer were gone. He knew that there was a surveillance camera right across the road that could help identify the thieves. Marty contacted the police, and an officer came and took the camera footage. However, despite Marty's persistent attempts to reach the investigator, he heard nothing from the police. It wasn't until several months later, after Tim's murder, that the Hamilton police contacted Marty, having discovered the stripped motorcycle and trailer. Where were they? In Millard's aviation hangar. This raises the question of why the police didn't use the footage to track Millard months earlier and save Tim. The third crucial lead that the police missed was the sudden demise of Wayne Millard, Dylan's father. After speaking with family members and colleagues, the police discovered that Wayne had threatened to cut off the funding for his son's extravagant lifestyle. Dylan was spending enormous sums of money and showed little interest in the family business. Wayne didn't want his son to destroy the fruits of his family's hard work and was planning to put an end to it, but he didn't get the chance. Wayne was found in his bedroom, deceased. He had suffered a gunshot wound to the head, and a revolver was found nearby. Initially, the case seemed obvious to the police. However, now that the detectives knew about Dylan, they wanted to re-examine the facts. At that time, he was not considered a suspect, although it's unclear why investigators didn't pay closer attention to his behavior. He appeared too calm, relaxed, and gave very strange answers to questions. However, when a relative passes away and someone needs to identify the body, if someone asked when was the last time they saw that person, nobody would answer, 5 minutes ago to the coroner. No, a person would recall the last time they saw their relative alive. The reason for this is that most people don't want to think about death. When answering such a question, the brain automatically goes back to a previous, more positive moment. But the problem with Dylan is that the murder brought him pleasure, so when asked about the last time he saw Wayne, he immediately thought about the body. One more important detail, Wayne was cremated, but his hands were tested for gunshot residue, and none was found. In combination with the odd behavior of the millionaire's son and the apparent financial benefit for the heir, it's strange that the police quickly closed the case. As for the family's friends and journalists, they were informed that the man died from a brain aneurysm. Since they didn't know the true cause of his death, no one suspected anything. Otherwise, they would likely have demanded a thorough investigation. When the detectives finally took up the case after Dylan and Mark's arrest, it wasn't difficult for them to discover that the revolver from which the bullet was fired had been purchased by Dylan prior to Laura Babcock's disappearance, and his DNA was found on it. Initially, Dylan claimed that he stayed at Mark's house before returning home around 6 p.m. and finding his father. However, phone records showed that he was at home from 1 a.m. to 6 a.m., precisely during Wayne's time of death. It's as if the accumulating evidence against the two was not enough. Dylan secretly passed 65 letters to Christine from prison, instructing her on what statements she should give. He ordered her to destroy all the letters immediately after reading them, but she did not comply. During the trial, Dylan and Mark almost confessed to the murder, shifting blame onto each other. However, in this case, it didn't matter who pulled the trigger. Both accomplices were found guilty of the murders of Tim and Laura and were sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for 25 years. Dylan received a similar punishment for his father's murder. The judge ruled that they would serve their sentences consecutively, meaning Dylan would have to spend 75 years in prison before he could even be eligible for parole. This is the maximum sentence ever imposed in the history of Ontario. Dylan's girlfriend, Christina Nuga, pleaded guilty to obstructing justice in relation to Tim's death. She revealed that she transported a car trailer and an incinerator to dispose of the evidence. The 24-year-old received a lenient punishment due to her testimony against Dylan and spent 3 months in prison. She later moved to Poland, where she attended medical school. The remains of Laura and Tim were never identified, but it is highly likely that they were found in the incinerator. Dylan Millard grew up in an affluent family and could have had everything he wanted. However, it turned out that what he wanted was to become a criminal. Just 2 years after meeting Mark, they started going on what they called night missions, stealing cars and motorcycles, not for profit, but for the thrill of it. They often burned them on the side of the road or destroyed them in an aircraft hangar. Once considered one of Canada's most eligible bachelors, he officially transformed into a serial killer, accused of murdering his father, former girlfriend, and an unknown person in less than a year. But if Laura and his father stood in Dylan's way, we will probably never know why he killed Tim. Whether out of boredom, audacity, or growing confidence that he could get away with anything, even murder. On Tuesday, February 11, 1997, Le Portel, a small town on the southern coast of Boulogne-sur-Mer, was celebrating its carnival for 3 days. The festival was in full swing, and tonight was the last night that everyone was eagerly anticipating. The Merlin sisters, Peggy and Amelie, had never missed it. Today they invited their friends Isabel and Audrey Raffin. The girls met 5 months ago. 16-year-old Amelie and 17-year-old Audrey became friends at school after the Raffin sisters moved to Le Portel. Soon they became inseparable, just like their older sisters, 20-year-old Peggy and Isabel. The girls spent the entire half of the day getting ready. Everything had to be perfect for the carnival evening. Finally, they were ready. Peggy transformed into a marquise, Amelie into Piero, Audrey chose a musketeer costume, and Isabel turned into an Indian. Their older sister Virginia joined Audrey and Isabel. At 8:30 p.m., the 5 girls left the house to walk to the square where the festival was taking place. Despite the cold and rain that evening, all 5 were in a great mood. The friends sang and danced together with everyone. People in carnival costumes gathered from all sides. Meeting their friends, they briefly stopped at a cafe to warm up. At 11:30 p.m., it was time to go down to the Portel beach to see the highlight of the show, the burning of Batista, a rag doll. This was the highlight that Peggy and Amelie wanted to show Audrey and Isabel. A huge bonfire had already been prepared on the beach. At midnight, the rag doll burned out, and as tradition requires, all carnival participants head to the village of Équien, located 3 kilometers to the south. 2 hours before that, the girls agreed to meet their friend Eve halfway and go together. But the young man never saw the girls. He decided that they had changed their minds and went to warm up at Peggy and Amelie's. In reality, there was no reason for Eve to worry since many people gathered at the carnival, and the townspeople in carnival costumes continued to walk back and forth between Portel and Équien. Morning came. The carnival was over and Peggy's and Amelie's mother came to the main square to pick them up. Marie-José Merlin bought croissants to have a snack with her daughters and listen to their stories about the evening, but they didn't show up at the meeting place. The woman returned home around 7:30 a.m., woke up Virginia and asked where the girls were and why they hadn't returned yet. Virginia replied that the carnival ends at 6 to 7 a.m. and they need more time to get back, or they might have stayed overnight at Isabel and Audrey's. Meanwhile, Isabel and Audrey's mother was also starting to get nervous. She had let her daughters go to the carnival and worried that they hadn't returned yet, but thought they had stayed overnight at Marie Jose's. As time went on, and when the two mothers spoke on the phone, it turned out that neither of them had seen the girls. None of their friends or relatives knew where they were. Anxiety was growing. It was not like the girls to disappear like this. They always let their families know if they were going to be late. At 9 o'clock in the evening, driven mad with worry, the parents went to the police station. But to their deep disappointment, the police officers were not at all concerned. The girls were at an age when they could relax and forget about everything, especially during the carnival season. The police officers assumed that there was a carnival in the neighboring town and the girls went there to have fun. In other words, the girls' disappearance amounted to a simple escape. However, the parents knew for sure that they would not have run away in carnival costumes without money and documents. Moreover, they were very attached to their mothers. Marie Jose Merlin had recently suffered a heart attack and the daughters were afraid to do anything that could upset their mother. Isabel and Audrey were also attached to their foster mother, Loa. The woman had adopted Audrey, Isabel, and their older sister Virginia after their mother's death when the girls were 3, 4, and 6 years old. The girls appreciated the love that surrounded them and would not have run away. Convinced that there was no point in running away and faced with the lack of reaction from the police, the relatives organized the search themselves. They began to post flyers around the city, searched the lighthouse, beaches, and abandoned bunkers built during World War II, and even inspected the abandoned tunnel of the city. The family even approached the boats moored at the pier and locked on them, assuming that the girls could be locked inside. In a cafe, they found a souvenir photo of Audrey in a musketeer costume, which confirmed that they were at the carnival. But for the next 48 hours, there was no other news about the girls. Then, thanks to flyers, calls from witnesses began to come to the Lamont family's home. People confirmed that they had seen the girls in Portel and remembered 4 outfits. But after the crowd headed to Equain, no one saw them. What is even more disturbing, witnesses reported a white van with white stripes, the passengers of which were staring at the walkers, following them, and generally behaving suspiciously. They also attracted increased attention because on that carnival evening, they were without costumes. This was a very interesting lead, but the police continued to adhere to the version of the escape. Families who were tired of hearing the same excuses decided to alert the press. Fortunately, journalists did not believe the escape version, and on Sunday, February 16th, an article appeared in the local newspaper. The journalist mentioned the van with green stripes. Reporters from all over the country picked up the story. Faced with pressure from the media, the prosecutor finally acknowledged that the escape may not be the only version of what happened. After 6 days of the girls' disappearance, the investigation started from scratch. The police quickly confirmed that a specific van was spotted on the night of the carnival and found witnesses, a family of 2, who reported the car's license plate number. At the same time, another call came into Laura's house. The woman reported that the wanted van was located in a neighboring village. According to the woman, it belonged to 2 scrap metal dealers who were well known in the village for their crimes. The woman added that they needed to hurry because the brothers were already repainting the van. With the license plate number, the police also identified the brothers as Jean-Michel and Jean-Louis Jordan. Could the brothers be the kidnappers of the 4 girls? It turned out that the brothers were long known to law enforcement. They grew up almost uneducated in completely unsuitable conditions for normal life. These people lived separately from society. According to rumors, their mother practiced incestuous relations with her sons, and their father was an aggressive alcoholic. 38-year-old Jean-Louis is the eldest in the family. He suffers from developmental abnormalities, was convicted of harassing girls, and spent 1.5 years behind bars. Barely released from prison, he received 10 years for violence against a girl but was released after 5. His brother Jean-Michel's criminal career is even more impressive. At 15, he attacked a 12-year-old girl so fiercely that he was sentenced to 10 years in prison, which is rare. After his release from prison, when his wife was preparing to become a mother, he killed his ex-girlfriend, 18-year-old Anita Dassenville. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison but was released after 9. Jean-Michel was married and had 3 children, one of whom, young Jennifer, died of meningitis. His second wife described him as a great husband and caring father, an opinion that was not shared by many. Those around him considered him a bundle of nerves with muscles. If young girls fell into the hands of the brothers, one should beware of the worst. The police had enough of this to interrogate the brothers. On Wednesday, a week after the girls' disappearance, the police carried out a large-scale operation to detain the Jordan brothers. And if they are the ones holding the girls, the slightest mistake could be fatal. Upon arrest, the brothers did not resist, but were surprised by the police's appearance. There were no girls in the house, although what the police saw there horrified them. The house resembled more of a dump, and there was a strong smell of filth. A little boy sat half-naked next to a German shepherd and was eating from a dog bowl. In total, there were 9 people living in the house, including 5 children under the age of 12. The police seized a van. It had been repainted, but what was even worse, the interior had been thoroughly clean. What are the brothers trying to hide? A race against time began for the investigators. They can only detain the brothers for up to 48 hours and need to make them talk, because right now they have suspicions, but absolutely no physical evidence. The brothers insisted in unison that they had not approached the carnival square. However, after the testimony of numerous witnesses was presented to them, they admitted to simply passing by but swore they had not crossed paths with any of the girls. By Friday morning, after the brothers had been in custody for 30 hours, time was running out for the investigators. So they decided to change tactics. The detective knew that the brothers had a younger sister who had disappeared long ago and was likely already dead. Jean-Louis was deeply attached to his sister and had been grieving her loss for a long time. The detective laid out photos of the missing girls and began telling the suspect about each one. He appealed to Jean-Louis' emotions, saying that they had families waiting for them. Although they couldn't save his sister, there was still a chance to help the girls and return them to their families. At these words, Jean-Louis leaned back in his chair, sighed, and declared that the girls were dead and that he was directly involved. He agreed to show where the bodies were buried. Journalists gathered outside the police station watched as the police car raced off in an unknown direction, and they followed. The entire procession stopped at the base of a dew. The police, together with Jean-Louis, went to the spot he had indicated. They had to dig for a very long time, so long that the detectives thought the man had deceived them and that there were no bodies there. Suddenly, a piece of red fabric from one of the musketeer costumes emerged. All 4 girls were lying in a pit measuring 1 by 2 meters. They were wearing carnival costumes that they had worn to the masquerade. On the other side of the dune, impatient journalists saw 4 hearses approaching. They arrived in silence. Then it became clear to them that the hearses were carrying the bodies of the 4 missing friends, and they rushed to report the news to the public. The families of the girls learned of the horrific news from the radio. The missing girls were found, but the nightmare was only beginning. On February 24th, forensic experts conducted an autopsy. They discovered that the perpetrators had chosen strangulation as their method of murder and had sexually assaulted 3 of the victims. Isabel became the first victim. She was severely beaten and then strangled. She likely put up the most resistance to her kidnappers. Peggy was sexually assaulted and then attempted to be strangled. However, she was buried alive. Sand was found in her esophagus, indicating that she was still breathing when she was buried. Amelie was even more beaten than the previous 2 girls. She was sexually assaulted and then killed. Finally, young Audrey was subjected to every kind of violence one can imagine. When Audrey was the last one alive, the perpetrators likely just played with her. Now the police wanted to know how it all happened. But during questioning, the brothers presented conflicting versions that only began the same way. Around 11 p.m., they met 4 girls dressed as musketeers, an Indian, a Marquise, and Piero, and agreed to give them a ride to Ikayan. They only had to drive 3 kilometers, and one of the girls quickly noticed that they had been driving too long and in the wrong direction. They yelled that they wanted to get out. One of the girls tried to open the van door, but it was blocked. According to Jean-Louis, Michel ordered him to calm down the captives, while he himself drove the van even faster. They arrived at Saint-Cécile Beach and brought the captives to an abandoned bunker. These are defensive structures that have survived in France since the war. The bunker has only one exit, which makes it an ideal prison for captives. And this is where the brothers' versions diverge. Jean-Louis said that he was guarding the girls in the blockhouse while Jean-Michel took them one by one. When his brother came for the last captive, Jean-Louis followed them to the top of the dune, where 3 girls were lying motionless on the ground. In his presence, Jean-Michel killed the 4th victim, and they buried the bodies together. Jean-Michel, in turn, admits that he led the victims to the blockhouse, but once inside, he left them in the company of his brother and went back for the keys, which he had left in the van. When he returned, his brother showed him 4 bodies lying on the top of the dune. They buried 2 of them. So, each of the brothers denies violence and murder. The most they did was to help bury the bodies. Without being able to rely on the suspects' statements, the detectives waited for evidence to prove the brothers' involvement in the murder. Forensic experts started with examining the van, which was an ideal trap. The lock on the back door was broken so that it could only be opened from the outside, and the van was cleaned out. However, upon closer inspection, investigators found a piece of an earring, a fragment of Audrey's earring that was torn off of her. This was evidence that the girls were brutally beaten inside the van. The problem was that besides the valuable evidence, the police did not find any DNA evidence of the brothers or the girls. They found some suspicious stains, possibly blood, but they were unable to conduct an analysis. Of course, the brothers cleaned it perfectly, but in 1999, the police did not have modern DNA analysis tools. Therefore, there was very little physical evidence to link the Jordan brothers to the crime. The DNA found on the victims' bodies did not allow for the exact identification of the perpetrator. Learning about this, Jean-Michel used this opportunity to retract his previous statements and deny any involvement in the crime. With minimal evidence and conflicting testimonies, the investigation could only rely on the reconstruction of the crime scene. Jean-Michel refused to cooperate, so the words of Jean-Louis were the only ones that could be verified. He showed the path that he, his brother, and the victims took towards the blackthorn bush. More accurately, they didn't walk, but rather crept because they first had to descend to the beach and then move along the boulders. It is important to remember that it rained on the night of the tragedy, and the tide reached almost to the blackthorn bush. Could 2 brothers lead 4 girls against their over wet and slippery stones in pitch darkness? But Jean-Louis insists that his brother then escorted each girl to the top of the dune. He describes the order in which his brother led the girls, of course not by name, but by their masquerade costumes. However, in the blackthorn bush, it was pitch dark, and the brothers had no flashlight. How could he have seen their costumes? Furthermore, the path he indicates is strewn with even greater obstacles. There is barbed wire on it, on which no piece of fabric was found, although the girls could not have crossed it without tearing their elaborate masquerade costumes. A careful examination of the girls' costumes did not reveal any tears or even snags. After this reconstruction, there were more questions than answers. The main ones being, under what circumstances were the girls killed, and how did the brothers divide the roles between themselves? The psychiatrist who talked to them described them as dangerous predators, especially Jean-Michel. Could either of them have remained hungry? Yet each of them insisted that at most, they helped the other bury the bodies. Now that the investigation is over, the jury will have to decide this dilemma. On October 16, 2002, the trial of the brothers began in St. Amma. During the trial, it became known that a few days before the carnival, the predators were already searching for prey. They almost kidnapped a young woman in Bursurma. She had been in a phone booth for 19 hours, and her friend was calling from another nearby booth. The girl noticed a van with green stripes that pulled up next to the payphone. The driver, whom she identified as Jean-Michel, stared at her intently when Jean-Louis appeared, ready to pull her inside by force. Luckily, her friend approached at that moment. Jean-Louis saw him, closed the door, and the van drove away. This was not the only similar story that the jurors heard, leading them to believe that the brothers had bought the van specifically for the purpose of kidnapping girls. However, Jean-Louis continued to claim that he had done nothing. It was like talking to a wall when trying to talk to his brother. The prosecutor was worried that the jurors would only accuse Jean-Michel, believing he had played a passive role. Jean-Louis, perhaps unintentionally, was playing a winning game. Therefore, the prosecutor requested that all participants in the trial be taken to the scene of the incident. Such a practice is very rare, but in this case, the prosecution considered it necessary to understand how events unfolded that night. On October 25, 2002, all court participants went to the beach of St. Cecile. As expected, the jurors could not even reach the Blackthorn, and you still need to climb to the top of the dune, overcoming a series of barbed wire. It is impossible to make such a journey at night without the victims tearing their clothes and trying to escape. Obviously, the girls were never in Blackthorn. This explains why, despite multiple signs of violence, there was no sand in their intimate areas. In other words, according to the results of the autopsy, the rape could not have occurred on the beach. The prosecutor is sure the violence and murder took place in the van in the presence of two brothers. They put the girls in the van, promising to take them to the beach. When Isabel realized that they were not going there, she panicked and tried to open the door, but in vain. Jean-Louis beat her fiercely to calm her down. In turn, Jean-Michel parked the van in a secluded corner of the campsite in the dunes, which is deserted at this time of year. The man turned off the engine and joined the girls and brother in the back of the van. The van was the instrument of the murder of the poor girls. It was there, in those horrific conditions, that they were beaten and killed. Peggy's DNA found under Amelie's fingernails provides additional heartbreaking details of the violence. While the girls were being abused, they held onto each other, seeking strength and support from their sister and friend. And then it's simple. You just need to open the door, walk 20 meters, and you'll find yourself at the top of the dune. What we don't know and will never know is what one did and what two did. The exact circumstances of the tragedy may be unclear, but the guilt of the two brothers is not in doubt, because the crime of one brother is so difficult to separate from the villainy of the other. As they prepared for the crime together and spread terror in the surrounding area together, the brothers were dubbed the Siamese Horror Brothers. On October 27, 2002, the verdict was announced. The brothers were sentenced to life imprisonment with maximum supervision for 22 years for Michel and 20 years for Louis. The slight difference is explained by the simple fact that without Louis' confession, the police would still be looking for the girls. To this day, the pain of the families is still very strong. Every year on February 12th, Marie Merlin and her son Gregory return to the beach of St. Cecile. It's the place where it all ended for them. Gregory says that today he should be a happy older brother, uncle. Instead, he mourns his sisters, kidnapped from the carnival on a night that was supposed to be one of the happiest days of their lives. In February 2003, the blockhouse that became a stumbling block in the case was blown up. The police protected the family from an angry mob, but a few days later, arson destroyed the Jordan family's home.
The criminal world of Liverpool was seriously shaken. 3 guys broke into a father and son's house and made off with a 30-kilogram stash of prohibited substances. The robbery sent shockwaves through the city's underworld. The gang that owned the stolen batch was once considered untouchable. A secret informant reported that the guys who lost goods worth £1 million were at the top of the city's criminal hierarchy. No one could believe that someone would dare to steal from them. Police managed to crack the case by gaining access to their phones, and in May 2022, some of them found themselves behind bars. However, Liverpool's gangs were still furious and tried to get to anyone they believed was involved in the heist. Rumors circulated that 35-year-old Joseph Nee had been gathering information for them. Joseph Nee had only recently been released from prison, where he served time for drug distribution and robbery. He was granted early release and was required to comply with parole conditions. Nee was part of a gang that trafficked Class A controlled substances into Liverpool, the most dangerous of them all. Joseph wasn't considered the most popular guy even within his criminal circle, and some had even targeted him before because even his own associates viewed him as an informant and a snitch. On August 22, 2022, Joseph and his friends gathered at a mutual acquaintance's house to watch a football match between Liverpool and United. The game ended at 21:52, and shortly after, Joseph left the house with one of his friends, Paul Abraham. Later, Paul would recount that they were simply walking down the street when, at 21:59, they heard 3 loud pops. Of course, they had heard such sounds before and instantly recognized them as gunshots. The men started running. The shooter circled around and began firing at the men from behind at close range. The attacker was very close to his target and, of course, knew how to handle a firearm. As a result, the bullet struck Joseph in the upper abdomen, and he fell immediately. Paul Abraham leaped over his fallen wounded friend and sprinted towards the park gates. It might not have been the noblest behavior towards a friend, but perhaps he knew that it wasn't worth risking his life for Joseph. At that moment, the armed man was in a perfect position, unlike his victim. Joseph lay unarmed, wounded, and defenseless on the ground, while the stranger, dressed in black and wearing a balaclava, confidently approached him, holding a 9mm pistol. Joseph begged for mercy, but the stranger paid no attention to his pleas and coldly squeezed the trigger. The shot could only have been lethal, but obviously the universe was on Joseph's side at that moment. As they say, the gun jammed and it didn't fire. Joseph didn't miss this chance to jump up and, despite his wound, run away. Surprisingly, the shooter was prepared for any turn of events. He calmly retrieved 2 weapons, a revolver, and continued the pursuit, never ceasing to fire. Meanwhile, Joseph was running in the direction of King's Hit Avenue, an ordinary street where ordinary families lived. This was the home of 46-year-old Cheryl Corbell and her 3 children, Chloe, Ryan, and their younger sister, 9-year-old Olivia, who everyone called Liv. Of course, all the residents on the street who were at home heard that there was some commotion outside. Some realized that these were gunshots, while others were puzzled about what was happening. Among them was Cheryl. The woman opened the door and looked out onto the street, as many would have done in her place. However, Joseph noticed the light in the partially open door, and he ran as fast as he could toward Cheryl's house. The woman was horrified to see an injured man approaching her, followed by an armed man in a mask. Quickly assessing the situation and realizing that it was not worth getting involved in the gang's altercation, she rushed back into the house and tried to slam the door. Unfortunately, the dropped latch prevented her from doing so. Joseph, desperate to escape and knowing that his time was running out because his pursuer was about to catch up with him, pounded on the door, begging the homeowner for help. Cheryl had already realized that these were some criminal gang troubles, and being a Liverpool resident, she understood that she and her family would face trouble if she got involved in something like this. So, she ordered the man to leave. She must have felt sorry for the wounded man, but her desire to protect her own children outweighed everything else. However, Joseph had no intention of leaving. He threw himself against the door with all his weight, breaking inside, knowing that this would bring enormous problems to the family. The man burst inside and collapsed on the floor, weakened from the chase and the gunshot wound. But the pursuer didn't back down. He saw Joseph Nee enter the house. Another person might have thought that there would always be another day, another opportunity to reach the target. But the shooter had no intention of giving up. He had a mission to accomplish, regardless of who he harmed. The commotion near the front door of the house, which had now shifted into the hallway, was accompanied by noise. Chloe, Ryan, and Olivia were sleeping, but they woke up due to the loud sounds. Ryan recalls that he was in his room when he heard 3 loud noises followed by quick footsteps. It was his younger sister, Olivia, running downstairs crying out, "Mom, I'm scared!" Ryan also came out of his room but stayed at the top of the stairs, watching in bewilderment as chaos unfolded below. He looked down and wondered who this man lying in the hallway was. He saw his mother trying to close the door, and his younger sister stood just a few steps away from the front door. Olivia wanted to be closer to her mother. She went down to her, crying, "Mom, I'm scared! Mom, I'm scared!" The assailant at this moment could not ignore the child's cries. He knew that Joseph Nee had burst into the home of an ordinary family with no connection to their disputes. He saw Cheryl trying to eject the stranger from the house, saw Joseph attempting to get inside, and heard Olivia's cries. However, none of this mattered to him because he simply started shooting through the gap in the door without thinking about where the bullets might hit. A bullet struck Cheryl, entering her right hand. But even though she was in pain, she continued to battle with the door. Joseph, at this moment, regained his senses to the point where he began to help her. He shouted at her to call the police because the shooter was still trying to force his way in. The shooter managed to push his hand with the revolver through the gap in the door. While Joseph began to plead with him to stop again, Cheryl jammed the door, including his hand with the weapon, before he began shooting once more. A bullet hit the door frame. Finally, the shooter decided he had spent too much time and retreated. Cheryl was able to breathe a sigh of relief, stopped struggling with the door, and rushed to comfort her daughter. She wasn't concerned about her own wound. The most important thing was to hug Olivia and tell her that everything would be okay, that no one would harm her now. Cheryl noticed that there was a lot of blood on Olivia's pajamas and thought that her wound on her arm was bleeding heavily. But then she lifted her daughter's shirt and realized that it wasn't her blood. Olivia had been shot. The same bullet that had injured Cheryl had gone through her right hand and into Olivia's chest. Olivia was gasping for air. Her mother knelt beside her, begging her daughter to stay with her. Ryan, who still hadn't realized that his sister was wounded, began shouting at Joseph to get out, but the uninvited guest had no intention of staying. Joseph managed to make a call and was picked up by his 2 friends in an SUV. They rushed him to the hospital, not giving a second thought to the condition they left the family members in, whose lives had just been forever changed. They simply abandoned them amidst all the chaos. While Cheryl called for help, she held Olivia in her arms and instructed her son to continuously apply pressure to the wound on Olivia's chest. Only then did the boy realize that his sister was injured. Olivia's lips had turned blue, and the bleeding had stopped. Ryan assisted his mother in carrying Olivia upstairs. They tried to stop the bleeding with towels. A neighbor arrived attempting to offer some assistance. Cheryl desperately tried to keep Olivia conscious. Later, she would tell the police that at some point, Olivia's body went limp and her eyes rolled upwards. It was at that moment that Cheryl realized Olivia had passed away. The police arrived at 10:10 p.m. An officer felt Olivia's faint heartbeat, and they carried her out of the house, rushing her to the nearest children's hospital in an ambulance. They held on to hope, but the doctors were unable to do anything. Olivia was pronounced dead at 11:24 p.m. Cheryl wasn't by her side when she passed, as she was receiving medical attention herself. Just a few hours earlier, it had been a normal, happy family, and now a mother and son were left as witnesses to the death of their 9-year-old daughter and sister. Meanwhile, a man named Thomas Cashman, known as Tommy, dressed in black but without the balaclava, rushed to the home of his former lover with whom he had a very brief affair. He entered her house without permission, scaring her terribly as he entered her bedroom. He was agitated and claimed that someone had tried to kill him, and he wanted to kill that person in return. In other words, he needed her help, and he was willing to say anything to get it. He even stated that she was the only one he could trust, despite having a fiancée with whom he had spent many years. The woman believed Tommy and offered him shelter for the night. However, the next morning, when all the media were buzzing about the shocking crime, she realized that Tommy had been involved in the shootout and was responsible for the death of 9-year-old Olivia Pratt-Corbel. Now, involuntarily, she became an accomplice. The woman was horrified by this prospect. On one hand, she didn't want to cover up a child killer, but on the other hand, any Liverpool resident knows how dangerous it can be to cross paths with criminal gangs. Uncertain about what to do, She called her boyfriend, Paul Russell. Paul arrived and had a private conversation with Tommy. Tommy immediately confessed to Paul that he had been hunting Joseph, but was abruptly cut off by Joseph, who asked him not to say anything about it to avoid implicating him in the crime. It was a very reasonable move on Joseph's part. What remains unclear is why he later made a significant mistake, giving Tommy different clothes, helping him get rid of the items he was wearing, and taking him to where his car was parked. Perhaps Paul understood that Tommy could pose a threat to him or his girlfriend and chose to assist him. But this act of help to a killer will likely have serious consequences for Paul as well. During this period, the investigation into the murder was in progress. Joseph Nee, who had suffered injuries, much like Cheryl and Olivia, declined to cooperate with the police. His primary concern was self-preservation, as the looming threat of returning to prison for violating his parole weighed heavily on him. Despite being involved in the criminal underworld, Joseph should have been able to surmise the identity of his assailant and whose orders the killer was following. Nevertheless, he informed the officers that anyone could have taken a shot at him that night. It's noteworthy that Joseph was not the only one apprehensive about engaging with law enforcement. Olivia had become the third Liverpool resident to succumb to gunshot wounds within a week, not to mention the numerous incidents where victims were shot but survived. In a city aptly nicknamed the British Amsterdam, crossing paths with criminal gangs was indeed perilous. A reward for information on Olivia's assailant had been announced, which quickly swelled to a record-high amount of £200,000, thanks to an anonymous contributor who added £100,000 to the fund. However, despite this substantial incentive, no one came forward with information. Nonetheless, the police succeeded in identifying a suspect, 34-year-old Thomas Cashman. He was a father of two, aged 4 and 14, engaged to a girl he had been dating since their school days. The family resided in a spacious suburban house in West Derby. Tommy had previously worked at a car wash, but his current lifestyle was vastly different. Officially unemployed, he rented a house that, in reality, belonged to the gang's leader. It was evident that his involvement in criminal activities afforded him a lavish life. Fortunately, Liverpool boasted extensive CCTV coverage, making it challenging to perpetrate an attack without being captured on camera. Investigation revealed that at 8:30 p.m., Tommy returned home, swiftly changed into black attire, and left his residence. He didn't make much effort to conceal himself while hunting his target. Surveillance footage documented him passing the house on Finch Lane several times before traversing past it once more. Tommy was convinced that his target was inside that house, having closely monitored his movements. He had even attempted to attack him earlier that day, though that endeavor had failed. When Joseph finally left the house, Tommy was resolute in his intent to eliminate him. However, fate took a different course, and an innocent bystander fell victim to a stray bullet. Such are the consequences when the worlds of ordinary individuals and criminals collide. Tommy's trousers, which he had provided to Paul Russell, were discovered at his sister's residence bearing his DNA. Gunpowder residue was also found on his right leg. Video evidence, DNA profiling, and gunpowder residue collectively linked him to the attack on Joseph. Yet the investigation had another valuable asset, a courageous witness who risked his life to oppose Liverpool's criminal underworld. In the early hours of September 4th, 2022, Tommy was apprehended while hiding at a friend's apartment. In October 2022, Tommy was formally charged with Olivia's murder, the attempted murder of Joseph and Cheryl, as well as possession of a firearm. Paul Russell faced charges of aiding and abetting, despite his earnest efforts to distance himself from the case. The trial of Tommy took place in Manchester in March 2023. Tommy denied all allegations. He claimed he hadn't killed anyone and that he appeared on the video because he was a local drug dealer, making deliveries that day and buying toys for his sick child. He added that he had no intention of killing anyone that day and that he had been friends with Joseph Nee for the past 10 years. However, his words were completely contradicted by a key prosecution witness. The remarkable effect came when Tommy's former girlfriend, who had sheltered him immediately after the crime, appeared in court. It was an incredibly brave move on her part, considering she lived in a city where many of Tommy's friends and gang members resided. Naturally, she would be protected under a witness protection program. As the police stated, she received more threats of violence than any other witness in Merseyside police history. She had to completely abandon her previous life, yet she chose to do the right thing. The witness explained her decision by saying that one should not be afraid to come forward when it involves the murder of a 9-year-old Olivia. The witness described how the accused came to her after the murder, trying to secure her support to create a false alibi. It's unclear why he couldn't ask his own fiancée for this favor. Tommy's defense team attempted to twist her words, suggesting that she wanted to frame her former lover because he refused to leave his fiancée for her. It was an absurd attempt to discredit the witness, and despite their efforts, she remained highly convincing. Following the witness's example, other people also found the courage to approach the police. They revealed that within criminal circles, Tommy was known as a contract killer or a hitman. He had been hired for various murders and was suspected in other homicide cases and assassination attempts, including another attempt on Joseph Nee's life with the same weapon used to kill Olivia on that fateful day. In fact, the same weapon had been used on January 27, 2020, when a 19-year-old was shot. It was evident that Tommy had hired a criminal cartel to assassinate Joseph Nee. On March 30th, after 3.5 weeks of court proceedings, the jury unanimously found Thomas Cashman guilty on all counts. The sentencing was scheduled for April 3rd. On the same day, Olivia's family intended to address the court, speaking to the murderer and recounting how the crime he committed had affected their entire family. However, Tommy refused to even appear in court on that day. He was sentenced to life imprisonment with the possibility of parole at a minimum of 42 years, making him 76 years old upon potential release. The judge commented on her decision, explaining that she would have preferred to sentence him to life without parole. However, she had to acknowledge the fact that Tommy didn't intend to kill Olivia. If he had intended to kill a child, he would have received a life sentence without the possibility of parole. It was evident to everyone in court that his target was another criminal. The judge took into consideration that he was also a father and wouldn't be able to see his children as often as he would have liked, but that was solely his own fault. She emphasized that the man's refusal to appear in court was not taken into account. Paul Russell was also found guilty of aiding and abetting and is currently in prison awaiting his sentence. Olivia's mother, Cheryl, had hoped to look the killer in the eyes and express her thoughts about him. However, he deprived her of this opportunity by not appearing in court. Cheryl admits that she didn't know he could simply choose not to come. Therefore, Olivia's family, particularly Cheryl and Olivia's Aunt Antonia, are advocating for changes in the law to require criminals to appear in court during sentencing and meet face-to-face with the victims' families. Since Olivia's murder, not much time has passed, and her mother admits that during these few months, she has been driven to madness by the deafening silence in their home. Olivia, from her childhood, was a chatterbox and giggler. If Olivia had survived in just 5 days, she would have performed a truly noble act. She intended to donate her hair to a charitable organization. She was eager to help an organization that makes wigs for sick children and had decided to cut off a whole 12 inches of her locks. People would have understood what a tremendous gesture it was coming from a 9-year-old girl. Giving a piece of herself to another child who needed it more would have shown just how wonderful Olivia was. The complete opposite of the people who invaded her home that August night in 2022 when Olivia took a bullet meant for a criminal. In memory of Olivia, other children created a beautiful corner in the park where she loved to play. They painted an enormous butterfly on the wall and planted flowers of a beautiful pink color. During Olivia's farewell at the church, hundreds of people gathered. Everything was adorned with pink butterflies. Olivia's mother, Cheryl, bid a moving farewell to her daughter, saying that Liv was loved and adored by everyone who knew her. She will never be forgotten. Cheryl added, "I won't say goodbye, but I'll say goodnight. I love you. We'll see you in the morning."